Welcome to another video on stories of our history. Today we are traveling to the south coast of England, to the county of Dorset, and more precisely to a wind-scoured chalk ridge known as Ridgeway Hill, just a few miles north of the seaside town of Weymouth. It was here, in the early summer of 2009, that a seemingly mundane infrastructure project, the construction of the Weymouth Relief Road, intended to ease traffic congestion ahead of the 2012 Olympic sailing events, literally broke open a chapter of history so violent and so scientifically revelatory that it has reshaped our understanding of the Viking Age. The workers were carving a deep cutting through the hill when their machinery began to uncover human bone. Oxford Archaeology, the commercial unit monitoring the earthworks, immediately halted construction and began a full excavation. What they unearthed over the following weeks was not a small scatter of bones, but a meticulously dug, oval pit containing the disarticulated and semi-articulated remains of 54 human beings, all young to middle-aged males, and every single one of them decapitated. The skulls had been carefully gathered and stacked together in a pile at the southern end of the grave, while the bodies, many still clad in the positions in which they had fallen or been thrown, lay jumbled together without any apparent care. This was no ordinary cemetery. It was a mass execution, an act of deliberate, public, and terrifyingly efficient violence. The discovery instantly captured the imagination of archaeologists and historians, because such a find is exceptionally rare in the English archaeological record. For the team on the ground, led by David Score of Oxford Archaeology, the immediate question was, who were these men, and why had they met such a fate on a lonely hill overlooking the English Channel? The excavation of the Ridgeway Hill pit was carried out with forensic precision, because every scrap of information could offer a clue. The soil was painstakingly sieved, the positions of each bone recorded in 3 dimensions using laser theodolites, and the surrounding landscape searched for any additional evidence of the execution event. The pit itself measured approximately 3.5 meters in length, 1.5 meters in width, and just over a meter in depth, cut directly into the solid chalk bedrock. The edges were sharp and regular, indicating that the hole had been dug specifically for the purpose of disposing the bodies, not a repurposed quarry or storage pit. Stratigraphic analysis of the layers above and below the bones, combined with the fragments of pottery found inside the fill, placed the event firmly in the late Anglo Saxon period, somewhere between the late 10th and early 11th centuries AD, the very height of the Second Viking Age in England. More telling were the cuts on the vertebrae. The cervical vertebrae of all 54 individuals bore deep, sharp incisions that matched the blows of a heavy, single-edged blade, such as a Sikh's or a Viking-style broadsword. In many cases the cuts went through the bone with such force that they sheared off portions of the mandible, or the base of the skull. All the cuts were delivered from the front, strongly suggesting that the victims were made to kneel and were beheaded one by one, likely with the executioner standing before them. There was no evidence of defensive wounds on the arms or hands, meaning these men were restrained or had already surrendered. They were not killed in the heat of battle. As the archaeologists carefully lifted the skulls, they noted that many still retained fragments of soft tissue at the moment of deposition, because the jaws had sagged open and some teeth had fallen out as decay progressed. But the way the skulls were stacked implied they were collected soon after decapitation, while the heads were still recognizably intact. This was a choreographed spectacle of death. The skeletal remains themselves told a story of hard, physical lives. Osteological analysis conducted by Dr. Louise Lowe of Oxford Archaeology, alongside an international team of bioarchaeologists, determined that all 54 individuals were male, with ages ranging from the late teens to about 45 years old, the prime fighting years. Their stature was notably tall for the period. The average height calculated from femur length was around 5 feet 8 inches to 5 feet 11 inches, considerably above the average for Anglo Saxon males of the time. Muscle attachment sites on the bones were exceptionally robust, indicating a lifetime of strenuous physical activity, rowing, hefting shields, swinging swords, and carrying heavy loads. Many of the skeletons showed well-healed antemortem fractures on ribs, clavicles, and forearms, injuries consistent with combat training and past battles. There were signs of chronic dental disease, abscesses, and tooth loss that pointed to a diet rich in carbohydrates and coarse grains, but also to a lack of the finer dental care that wealthier individuals might have enjoyed. Intriguingly, some bones exhibited cut marks that were not related to the execution, but rather to the removal of muscle tissue or the stripping of soft tissue from the body before burial, a curious detail that raised questions about whether the bodies had been manipulated after death, perhaps to remove valuable armor or to ritually dishonor the dead. What was absolutely clear, however, was that these individuals were not peasant levies hastily gathered from local farms. They were professional warriors, conditioned by a life of seafaring and violence, and they had died not as heroes in battle but as captives subjected to a humiliating mass execution. The pressing archaeological puzzle was where these men had come from. The initial hypothesis leaned towards a tragic event involving local Anglo Saxons, perhaps a punitive execution of criminals or rebels. However, the combination of their tall stature, muscular build, and a few small objects recovered from the grave, a single iron buckle of a type known from the Scandinavian world, and the cut marks themselves suggesting execution styles more akin to judicial killings described in Norse law codes, began to steer the interpretation towards a far more dramatic possibility. The team decided to employ a technique that would turn the investigation on its head: isotopic analysis of the tooth enamel. Teeth, once formed during childhood and adolescence, lock in a chemical signature of the geological environment where the person drank water and consumed locally grown food. The ratio of strontium isotopes, specifically strontium-8 7 to strontium-8 6, reflects the age and type of the underlying bedrock, a signature that varies dramatically between the ancient granites of Scandinavia and the chalk downs of southern England. Oxygen isotopes, measured as the ratio of oxygen 1,8 to oxygen 1,6 in the phosphate of tooth enamel, relate to the average temperature and latitude of the drinking water, which is heavily influenced by climate. By drilling tiny samples from the molars of the skeletons and running them through a mass spectrometer, the scientists could trace, with a precision never before applied to a mass grave of this period, the childhood homelands of each of the 54 executed men. The results would prove to be a bombshell that not only confirmed their Viking origin but revealed a geopolitical complexity that still makes headlines today. When the first isotopic data began to arrive from the laboratories of the British Geological Survey and Durham University, the research team, led by Dr. Jane Evans, a specialist in strontium isotope analysis, knew they were dealing with something unprecedented. The strontium signatures from the tooth enamel of the 54 individuals fell entirely outside the known range for the British Isles. In England, the biosphere strontium ratios, influenced largely by the chalk and limestone that dominate much of the landscape south of a line from the Wash to the Severn, tend to cluster around 0.708 to 0.710, with older igneous regions of western Britain showing slightly higher values. The Ridgeway Hill samples, by contrast, displayed a wide spread of values that pointed emphatically towards the ancient Precambrian shield rocks of Scandinavia, where strontium ratios commonly exceed 0.715 and can go as high as 0.735 in regions rich in old granites and metamorphic terrains. This alone was enough to demonstrate that none of these men had spent their childhood in England, or indeed anywhere in the British archipelago. But the researchers pressed further. By plotting the strontium data against the oxygen isotope values, they were able to subdivide the group into at least 3 distinct clusters, each corresponding to a different geographic region and, by extension, a different climatic and geological setting. The first cluster, with the lowest strontium values and oxygen ratios indicating a relatively milder, coastal climate, mapped perfectly onto the southernmost parts of Scandinavia, modern-day Denmark, the Scanian province of Sweden, and the islands of the Baltic entrance, places where thousands of aspiring Viking warriors had launched their longboats for generations. The second cluster, with intermediate strontium values and distinctly colder oxygen signatures, pointed to central Sweden, the area around Lake Mälaren and the great trading emporium of Birka, a heartland of the Sphere people who were consolidating the Kingdom of Sweden. The third cluster was the most startling: extremely high strontium ratios, combined with the most depleted oxygen 1,8 values, indicating childhood spent above the Arctic Circle. The likely source was northern Norway, the rugged fjord lands of Trondelag, or even the far northern coast of what is now Troms, where the Sami and Norse populations coexisted. This meant that the 54 men executed on that Dorset hill had not been a cohesive band of brothers from a single chieftain's household. They had been a multi-regional composite, a consciously assembled fighting unit drawing manpower from across the Scandinavian world. The implications of this isotopic evidence cascaded through the archaeological community and into the interpretation of Viking Age warfare. For decades, the popular image of a Viking raiding party was that of a local lord, perhaps a petty king or a prominent landowner, gathering his kin, his huskarler, household troops, and his allied neighbors to set sail in search of plunder. The Ridgeway Hill grave upended that assumption with hard chemical data. The crew that met its end in Dorset had been recruited from a geographical span of well over 1,000 miles, from the sandy pastures of Jutland to the frozen coasts of the North Atlantic. Such diversity suggests a far more organized and mercantile approach to raiding than previously credited. The 10th and early 11th centuries saw the rise of powerful Scandinavian rulers, such as Harald Bluetooth of Denmark and later Sweyn Forkbeard, who were building something close to royal navies. The composition of the Weymouth crew aligns with the idea that these forces were composed of li, a term used in Old Norse for a fleet-based military company that was often multi-ethnic and gathered from various regions under a war leader's banner. They were bound not by kinship but by a profit-sharing agreement, a kind of early joint stock company of violence, where the leader provided ships and logistical support and the participants contributed their fighting skills in exchange for a share of the silver, slaves, and land captured. This model of organization explains why men from such disparate and distant homelands could end up fighting side by side and dying together on a foreign shore. It also hints at the logistical sophistication of these operations, with central points of muster, standardized ship types, and established sea routes that funneled warriors from the most remote fjords to the assembly areas in the Limfjord or at the trading center of Hedeby before the crossing to England. As the isotopic mapping grew more refined, the researchers could even identify with some probability the specific geological provinces of origin. For the Danish group, the strontium values around 0.7100.714 are characteristic of the younger moraine landscapes of eastern Jutland and the Danish islands, regions that had been densely populated and heavily involved in the raiding economy since the 9th century. For the sphere group from central Sweden, values of 0.7 to 0.728 align with the ancient granitoids and gneisses of the Bergslagen region, an area rich in iron and copper, the very metals that fueled the weapons industry of the Viking Age. The northern Norwegian group, with strontium ratios soaring above 0.730 and oxygen values suggesting mean annual temperatures several degrees colder than the North Sea zone, almost certainly originated from the exposed shield rocks north of the Arctic Circle, where small Norse chiefdoms eked out a living from fishing, hunting, and occasional tribute-taking from Sami hunters. Intriguingly, one or two individuals showed strontium values that fell into a possible Baltic intermediate range, maybe from the eastern shores of present-day Estonia or Latvia, areas that were in contact with Scandinavian traders and sometimes provided mercenaries. The presence of even a few eastern Baltic warriors would amplify the picture of a pan-Scandinavian force, a kaleidoscope of peoples drawn by the magnetic pull of England's wealth. The isotopic analysis, published in the Journal of Archaeological Science in 2012, remains one of the most granular and wide-ranging mobility studies ever conducted on a medieval mass grave, and it laid the foundation for a complete rewriting of the narrative of this execution site. Beyond the sheer geographic spread, the isotopic data also allowed the team to revisit the osteological observations and interpret them in a new light. The muscle-bound frames and old-healed injuries of the 54 men were exactly what one would expect of a professional roving war band that had signed on for a season of campaigning. The fact that many had lost teeth and suffered from chronic abscesses might reflect the typical hardtack and dried fish diet of a longship voyage, where scurvy was a constant threat and fresh provisions were scarce. Furthermore, the variation in oxygen isotopes within the group indicated that these men had not all been together since childhood. They had grown up in different climatic regions, meaning they must have met and formed this company relatively shortly before their ill-fated expedition. The archaeological evidence thus began to reconstruct not just a static tomb, but a dynamic story of movement. Young warriors recruited in the markets and harbors of Scandinavia, perhaps at Hedeby, Birka, or Koppang, lured by promises of English silver from the Danegeld, the massive tribute payments that were flowing north in ever-increasing amounts from the beleaguered Anglo Saxon kingdom. They would have been equipped with standard-issue weapons, perhaps supplied by the fleet owner, and given the typical shield, sword or axe, and a leather-lined tunic. The absence of any personal ornaments or weapons in the grave, only that one iron buckle, is itself a crucial detail. The executioners would have stripped the captives of anything valuable before killing them, a common practice in judicial executions of the period. All these threads combined to paint the 54 as a group of sea-born mercenaries, a vanguard of a new kind of warfare that would soon conquer a kingdom. To understand how those 54 men came to be lying headless in a chalk pit on Ridgeway Hill, we must first immerse ourselves in the historical landscape of late 10th century England, a realm teetering on the edge of collapse under the relentless pressure of Scandinavian attacks. The Kingdom of England, forged only a generation earlier by King Athelstan, was now ruled by Æthelred II, a monarch whose posthumous nickname, the Unready, captures the profound crisis of his reign. The name is actually a pun on his first name, Æthelred meaning noble counsel, and Unready meaning ill counsel, or bad counsel. But the popular perception of an indecisive king unable to meet the Viking threat is not far from the truth. From the 980s onward, Viking raiding, which had subsided during the 10th century thanks to the strong defenses of Alfred the Great's successors, returned with a vengeance. Small-scale hit-and-run attacks along the coasts of Wessex, Sussex, and Kent gave way to large-scale fleets that wintered on English soil, extorting vast sums of silver and gold, the Danegeld, as the price of temporary peace. The Anglo Saxon Chronicle, the primary narrative source of the period, records with mounting despair the annual arrival of the raiding army, burning, looting, and slaughtering. In 991, a Norwegian force under Olaf Tryggvason defeated the alderman Bertnoth at the Battle of Malden in Essex, after which Æthelred paid the first massive tribute of 10,000 pounds of silver. That payment only whetted the appetite of the wolves, and soon the fleets grew larger and more aggressive, including not just Norwegians but Danes, Swedes, and all manner of adventurers who saw England as a helpless treasury waiting to be emptied. It was in this fraught context that the events leading to the St. Brice's Day massacre of 1002 unfolded, a royal decree that may hold the key to the Weymouth mass grave. According to the Anglo Saxon Chronicle, Æthelred, convinced that the Danes settled in England, including those who had been given land in the Danelaw, were plotting to assassinate him and seize his kingdom, issued an order on November 13, 1002, the feast day of St. Brice, that all the Danish men who were in England should be killed. The historicity and scale of this massacre have been debated fiercely, but there is archaeological and place name evidence that something horrific did indeed happen. A charnel pit in Oxford containing the remains of between 34 and 38 individuals, predominantly young men of Scandinavian origin, was discovered in 2008 beneath St. John's College and carbon dated to the early 11th century. It is widely seen as a direct consequence of the St. Brice's Day order. The victims there had been brutally killed, some hacked from behind while trying to flee, and then dumped in a mass grave, a grim parallel to Ridgeway Hill. The decree, whether it was carried out efficiently or spiraled into local pogroms, represented a radical escalation, a desperate attempt by Æthelred to eliminate a perceived fifth column. But rather than solving his problems, it triggered a chain reaction of vengeance, most famously when Sweyn Forkbeard of Denmark, whose sister and brother-in-law were supposedly among the slain, launched a series of invasions that would ultimately drive Æthelred into exile and place Sweyn on the English throne, albeit briefly. The Weymouth execution, however, does not fit neatly into the St. Brice's Day massacre in terms of locale or demographic. The St. Brice's decree targeted Danish settlers living within English society, often merchants, craftsmen, farmers, not necessarily armed raiders captured in battle. The 54 men on Ridgeway Hill were clearly an external military force, a raiding party that had been ambushed or surrounded and then summarily executed by the local Anglo Saxon authorities. Radiocarbon dating of the bones, using accelerator mass spectrometry on collagen extracted from ribs and femurs, yielded a calibrated date range of AD 970 to 1025, with the highest probability falling between AD 980 and 1020. This range comfortably includes the St. Brice's Day massacre, 1002, but also extends before and after. Some historians, such as Professor Ryan Lavelle, have suggested that the execution might be connected to a specific recorded event. In the year 1001, a large Danish fleet attacked the coast of Wessex, burning villages from the Isle of Wight to Devon and then turning east, where they were confronted by the fjord, the local levy, of Hampshire and Dorset. The chronicle mentions that the English were victorious, and that the raiders were driven into the sea, but there is no mention of mass executions. Another possibility ties to a raid documented in the same decade targeting Portland, the rocky peninsula just south of Weymouth. Local tradition, recorded later, speaks of a force of Vikings landing at Portland and being defeated by the local thanes, with the survivors put to death on the hills so that the sight of their heads could serve as a warning to any ship passing below. Regardless of the exact event, the archaeological context makes it clear that these 54 men were not killed in scattered skirmishes but were executed together, at one time, in a highly ritualized and punitive manner, signaling that the Anglo-Saxons of Dorset were fully capable of meeting Viking violence with equal brutality. The geopolitical stage of the late 10th century was thus set for confrontations of this kind. The men of Wessex, the heartland of the English kingdom, still bore the institutional memory of King Alfred's birdhouse system, a network of fortified towns that could be used to resist and contain raiding bands. Dorset itself was dotted with such as Wareham, Bridport, Dorchester, and Shaftesbury, all of which served as rallying points for the fjord. The coastal lookout system, known as the heap or military road along the chalk ridges, allowed swift communication of an enemy landing. When a Viking fleet appeared off the coast, the warning would have spread rapidly, with beacons flaring from hilltop to hilltop, and the local aldermen would mobilize the select fjord, the elite mounted infantry of the Thanley class, while raising the great fjord of ordinary searles to block the raiders' advance. The chances of a small Viking party being intercepted, cut off from their ships, and forced to surrender were high, especially if they had ventured inland to raid and their sea escape was blocked by unfavorable tides or a well-timed counterattack. The 54 men under our lens likely fell into exactly such a trap. Perhaps they had beached their longships in the sheltered waters of Weymouth Bay, or the Fleet Lagoon behind Chesil Beach, and moved inland along the River Wey, only to find the local defenders had outmaneuvered them, seizing the high ground on Ridgeway Hill. The strategic position of the execution site, on a prominent chalk ridge visible for miles, was no accident. It was a statement, a piece of performative justice meant to terrorize the next wave of seawolves. Stepping into the forensic pathology of the Ridgeway Hill pit allows us to reconstruct, almost blow by blow, the mechanics of the massacre. The cutting of the vertebrae and the preservation of the skulls offer an exceptionally detailed anatomical record of the decapitation method used by the executioners. What makes this case so compelling is the sheer uniformity of the trauma. On every cervical spine that survived intact, the path of the blade was horizontal or slightly downward, entering from the anterior, front, side of the neck and exiting posteriorly. This pattern is consistent with a single technique. The victim was made to kneel with the head bent slightly forward, exposing the space between the third and fifth cervical vertebrae, and the executioner, standing directly in front, delivered a powerful two-handed or one-handed blow with a blade. The edge of the weapon, almost certainly a heavy Seax or a two-edged Anglo-Saxon sword, sliced through the skin, the strap muscles of the neck, the trachea, the esophagus, and the carotid arteries before biting into the vertebrae. In many cases the blade struck exactly through the intervertebral disc space, shearing the cartilage and leaving characteristic cut marks on the adjacent bone surfaces, smooth, planar incisions with no signs of chipping or hesitation. Where the blade struck the vertebra body itself, the dense cortical bone of the anterior vertebral body was cleaved with a single, clean fracture. testifying to the immense force and skill of the executioner. In several individuals, the blow was so powerful that it carried through the neck completely, severing the head in one sweep. In others, a second cut was necessary, evident from overlapping slice marks on the vertebra and the back of the mandible. But there were no wounds consistent with hacking or chopping from behind, no evidence that the victims were running or struggling, and absolutely no defensive cuts on the radius or ulna, the forensic signature of a person trying to shield their head with their arms. This absence tells us that the Vikings were under complete physical control at the moment of death, likely bound at the wrists or restrained by guards. The skulls themselves, 54 weathered but eloquent testimonies, provided additional gruesome details. Because they were found in a dense pile, many of them had been crushed post-mortem by the weight of the soil, but enough survived intact for a full anthropological inventory. The scientists meticulously catalogued every fracture, every chop mark, and every variation in the decapitation plane. What they discovered was that the cuts were remarkably high, often slicing through the mandible, the jawbone, and even the base of the cranium. In several skulls, the blade had entered just below the ear, transected the jaw near the temporomandibular joint, and exited through the opposite side of the neck, a trajectory that suggests the executioners deliberately targeted a point that would sever both the spinal cord and the major blood vessels in a single blow, while also providing a trophy that included part of the jaw. A gruesome display reminiscent of headhunting practices known in Norse and Anglo Saxon warrior culture. Some of the vertebrae still retained the odontid process of the second cervical vertebra, the dens, which normally sits snugly within the atlas vertebra. That this fragile bone was intact in many cases indicates that the heads were not twisted or wrenched off. The bodies were beheaded cleanly, and the heads then gathered up shortly after. Furthermore, the cut ends of the spinal columns left attached to the skull bases showed no signs of gnawing by scavengers, confirming that the burial followed the execution rapidly, probably within hours or a day at most. The neat stacking of the skulls in a pile at the southern end of the pit, almost as a separate deposit, has been interpreted as an act of ritual degradation. The heads, the seat of the warrior's honor and identity, were deliberately segregated from the bodies, a symbolic obliteration of the personhood of these hated seafarers. Beyond the decapitation, the postcranial bones, the bodies below the neck, tell a secondary story of perimortem and postmortem treatment. Several of the bodies showed perimortem chop marks on the upper thoracic vertebrae and the clavicles that were not part of the beheading but suggested the removal of the arms or the severing of the shoulder girdle. Could the executioners have dismembered some of the bodies as an additional indignity? Or was this simply the result of the chaotic way the corpses were handled? The archaeological notes mention that the arms of many skeletons were missing hands and feet, but this is more likely due to the later truncation of the pit during road construction. The pit had been partly truncated by a modern service trench, unfortunately destroying some extremities. Nevertheless, the overall completeness of the remains allowed for a robust demographic profile. The age at death, determined through dental wear, cranial suture closure, and the ossification of the medial clavicle and iliac crest, clustered between 18 and 45, with the largest cohort being men in their 20s and early 30s. This is precisely the age range one would expect of an active raiding force, young enough to be fit and aggressive, yet experienced enough to have survived previous campaigns. Not a single individual showed advanced arthritic degeneration or geriatric frailty. The dental pathology revealed a remarkable consistency, high rates of dental enamel hypoplasia, which are linear defects in the tooth enamel caused by episodes of malnutrition or disease during childhood, were present in over half the group. This points to early life stress, perhaps famine or epidemic, common in the marginal agricultural lands of Scandinavia. The teeth also displayed extensive occlusal wear, far beyond what is typical of an Anglo Saxon diet, a hallmark of the coarse barley breads and dried fish consumed on long sea voyages, often mixed with grit from cornstones. All these biological markers resonated with the isotopic message. These were hard-bred northern men who had eaten a northern diet and died a southern death. The context of the grave fill itself warrants careful scrutiny. The bodies had been thrown into the pit without any attempt at orderly arrangement, many of them piled on top of each other in a jumble of arms and legs, with some individuals lying prone and others supine. Yet the skulls were conspicuously separate. This practice echoes other mass executions from the early medieval period, such as the 11th century execution cemetery at Wockington Wold in Yorkshire, where decapitated individuals also had their skulls placed apart. The deliberate separation of head from body has deep symbolic meaning in Germanic and Norse cultures. The head was considered the seat of the spirit, of the and, in Old Norse thought, and to deprive a warrior of his head was to condemn him to a dishonorable afterlife, unable to enter Valhalla with his weapon in hand. For the Anglo Saxon executioners, who were themselves heirs to the same Germanic traditions, the act would have carried a similar cultural charge. They were not merely killing enemies, they were annihilating them, soul and body. This ritualistic component elevates the Ridgeway Hill execution from a mere military expedient to a deeply ideological statement. The landscape chosen, the highest point of the ridge, visible from the sea, reinforced the message. Any ship attempting to land would see, perhaps initially, the stakes or the heads themselves displayed before burial, a ghastly totem that proclaimed, "This is the price of raiding Wessex." If the bones and the wound patterns told us how the men died, it was the invisible chemical signatures locked within their teeth that told us who they really were. The science of isotopic provenancing, which has revolutionized archaeology since the 1990s, rests on the principle that you are what you eat and drink. And more precisely, you are where you grew up. Tooth enamel, the hardest biological material in the human body, is formed during childhood, first in the deciduous teeth and then permanently in the adult molars and premolars between the ages of about 6 months and 12 years. As the enamel matrix mineralizes, it incorporates elements like strontium and oxygen from the food and water ingested at that time. Crucially, enamel does not remodel once formed, it remains a locked chemical archive of that early life geography. Strontium, a trace element chemically similar to calcium, substitutes into the hydroxyapatite crystal of teeth and bones. Its isotopic ratio, the proportion of the stable isotopes strontium-87 to strontium-86, varies across the landscape because strontium-87 is produced by the radioactive decay of rubidium-87, which is abundant in old, potassium-rich rocks like granites. Regions dominated by ancient cratonic rocks, such as the Baltic Shield that underlies Scandinavia, exhibit high strontium-87/strontium-86 ratios, typically above 0.715, while younger terrains like the chalk and limestone of southern England show low ratios, usually below 0.710. Oxygen isotopes in the phosphate component of enamel, expressed as delta superscript 10, reflect the isotopic composition of meteoric water, rainwater, streams, lakes, that the individual consumed. This in turn depends on latitude, altitude, distance from the coast, and mean annual temperature. The colder the climate and the higher the latitude, the more the lighter oxygen 16 evaporates, and the more depleted the water becomes in oxygen 18, yielding lower delta superscript 10 values. Thus, a man who grew up drinking water from Arctic streams will have a strikingly different oxygen isotope profile from one who grew up on the mild, rainy coast of Wessex. The sampling procedure at Ridgeway Hill was meticulous. From each of the 54 skulls, the team extracted a single molar, preferably the second or third molar that mineralizes relatively late in childhood, ensuring the signal captured the geography of later childhood and adolescence rather than the earliest infancy. A tiny drill was used to abrade the enamel surface, removing a small amount of powder, about 5 to 10 milligrams, while avoiding the dentine underneath, which can be contaminated by later diagenetic changes in the burial environment. The powder was chemically purified to isolate strontium, then loaded into a thermal ionization mass spectrometer at the NERC Isotope Geosciences Laboratory in Keyworth. Simultaneously, phosphate oxygen isotopes were analyzed at Durham University using a continuous flow isotope ratio mass spectrometer. The results, cross-plotted on a graph, created a cloud of points that sorted itself into the 3 distinct clusters we have described. The majority of the individuals, around 35 of the 54, fell into a cluster with strontium ratios between 0.710 and 0.714 and delta superscript 10 values around 4 per thousand to 6 per thousand, matching the signature of southern Scandinavia, the Jutland Peninsula, the Danish islands of Funen and Zealand, and the southerly coast of present-day Sweden. This was the heartland of the Danes, the very people that the English chroniclers referred to as the Danes, regardless of their precise origin. Another group of about 12 individuals displayed distinctly higher strontium ratios, 0.7 to 0.728, and lower delta superscript 10, 7 per thousand to 9 per thousand, pointing to central Sweden, the region of Uppland, Västmanland, and the Mälaren Valley. This was the power base of the sphere, the core of the emerging Swedish kingdom, and the location of Birka, a major Viking Age town that funneled warriors and merchants east and west. The third and smallest cluster, roughly 7 individuals, had the most extreme values, strontium ratios soaring above 0.730 and oxygen isotopes dropping below 10 per thousand, indicative of the Arctic and subarctic territories of northern Norway. Their isotopic signature closely matched that of modern reindeer herders from Finnmark and the Lofoten Islands, a region where chieftains like the legendary Hålogaland rulers built their power on the fur trade, walrus ivory, and a steady export of tough, sea-hardened warriors. Beyond these 3 clusters, a handful of outliers, perhaps 2 or 3 individuals, exhibited ambiguous values that could reflect mobility during childhood or origins in areas where the geology produced overlapping signals, such as the Baltic coast of present-day Estonia or the islands of Åland. The presence of these outliers only emphasized the heterogeneity of the group. What was entirely absent was any individual with a British isotopic signature. Every single one of the 54 would have been a foreigner to the Anglo Saxons who killed them. The isotopic study, which was published in the journal Antiquity and widely covered in the scientific press, fundamentally transformed the understanding of the Ridgeway Hill grave from a provincial massacre into a revelation about the nature of Viking military organization. It demonstrated beyond doubt that the Mysel here, the great armies that ravaged England, were not monoethnic blocks but composite, opportunistic forces assembled from across the Norse world. The model of a chieftain sailing with his neighbors from the same fjord suddenly seemed quaint. Instead, the 54 men encapsulated the international character of a trading and raiding diaspora that stretched from the Arctic Circle to the Mediterranean, recruiting soldiers the way a modern private military company hires contractors. The realization that the Weymouth Vikings were a multinational crew opens a fascinating window into the sociology of the late Viking Age. How did men from such disparate ends of the Scandinavian world, a Danish merchant warrior from Hedeby, a sphere aristocrat's son from Birka, and a tough, wolfskin-clad skald from Lofoten, end up fighting shoulder to shoulder on the shores of Dorset? The answer lies in the transformation of Scandinavian society from a clan-based structure to a more monetized and state-organized war machine. By the year 1000, the Viking phenomenon was no longer a series of small-scale seasonal raids. It had evolved into a large-scale, royally sponsored enterprise. Kings like Harald Bluetooth, who erected the famous Jelling Stone declaring that he won for himself all of Denmark and Norway and made the Danes Christian, were consolidating power over vast territories and using the wealth from raiding and the Danegeld to fund their state-building projects. In this context, the Lee, a term found in runic inscriptions and Old Norse literature meaning a fleet, or following, became the key organizational unit. A Lee was a contract-based maritime brotherhood, bound by a mutual oath rather than kinship, whose members shared the spoils according to agreed rules. Some lists were enormous, comprising dozens of ships and thousands of men. The Jomsvikings, a semi-legendary brotherhood stationed at the fortress of Jomsborg on the Baltic coast, are the most famous example, but the institution was widespread. Men would join a Lee for a season or a campaign, bringing their own weapons, and the leader of the Lee, often a jarl or a king's representative, would provide the ships, the logistical chain, and the strategic direction. The Ridgeway Hill men almost certainly belonged to such a Lee, a crew assembled not from a single valley but from the hustings and harbor towns where warriors for hire congregated. The economic lure that united these diverse men was the flood of silver flowing out of England. In the period 99111012, according to the Anglo Saxon Chronicle, The English paid at least £134,000 of silver and gold to Viking armies in 7 major Danegeld payments, an astronomical sum that equates to roughly 60 million silver pennies, more coins than would circulate in entire Scandinavian economies for centuries. This torrent of precious metal magnetized adventurers from every corner of the Norse world. The distribution maps of English coin hoards found in Scandinavia, particularly in Denmark, Sweden, and even in far-flung locales like the Åland Islands and Estonia, show that the Danegeld silver penetrated deep into the northern homelands. A warrior from a remote northern Norwegian farmstead could expect to return from a successful season in England with more silver than his family had seen in generations, enabling him to buy land, marry well, and elevate his social standing. The lease system democratized access to this wealth. You did not need to be born a jarl's son to join a raiding fleet. You just needed to be fit, armed, and willing to swear the oath. This created a pan-Scandinavian labor market for violence, in which young men from the peripheries, the cold, rocky fjords of the north, the forested interior of Sweden, could sell their sword arm to a war captain who would ship them to the richest hunting grounds in Europe. The isotopic diversity of the 54 precisely mirrors this labor market. The older, more established Danish polities contributed the core of experienced raiders, the spheres supplied a cadre of well-equipped heavy infantry, and the Arctic periphery provided the shock troops, men accustomed to lethal close-quarters fighting in the confined decks of longships. The journey that brought these 54 men together likely began months before their death, in the early spring when the ice broke in the fjords and the season for seafaring began. Word would have reached the northern settlements that a chieftain, perhaps a follower of the Danish king Sweyn Forkbeard, was recruiting for an expedition to England. The chieftain or his agents traveled to the assembly places or the major trading towns, Skiringsel, Koppang, in Norway, Birka in Sweden, Hedeby in Denmark, and offered terms. Warriors who signed on would receive a small advance, enough to equip themselves with a mail shirt or a good axe, and would be promised a share of the loot according to a fixed scale. Some may have come as pairs or small groups, but the force that assembled in the Limfjord, or at the anchorage off the island of Funen, would have been a mosaic of dialects, customs, and fighting styles. Ships were loaded with provisions, barrels of salted fish, hard barley bread, dried meat, and skins of sour whey to drink. The fleet would then wait for the right wind, and once underway, they would cross the North Sea in a matter of days, navigating by the sun and the stars, using the known sea marks, the Farne Islands, the Humber, the chalk cliffs of the south coast, to make landfall. The target area, the coast of Wessex, was chosen because it was the heart of the English kingdom and rich in churches, monasteries, and royal estates that promised the richest plunder. The choice of Dorset specifically might have been tactical. The Isle of Purbeck and the Fleet Lagoon offered sheltered anchorage, and the inland valleys led to the wealthy town of Dorchester and the nunnery at Shaftesbury. Everything was set for a highly profitable raid, until something went catastrophically wrong. The disaster that befell this warband can only be pieced together from the archaeological clues and the broad historical record, but the physical evidence on the ground strongly suggests that they were intercepted by a superior force, perhaps the shire levies of Dorset, and driven inland, away from their ships. The topography of Ridgeway Hill itself offers a clue. The hill is a chalk spur projecting south from the main Dorset Ridge, commanding a panoramic view over Weymouth Bay, the Isle of Portland, and the Fleet. If the Vikings had advanced inland along the River Wey, they would have been funneled into a narrow valley with steep flanks. Anglo Saxon scouts, posted on the ridge, would have spotted them from miles away, and the fjord, moving rapidly along the Ridgeway path, could have cut off their retreat to the sea. The execution site on the very lip of the ridge was not a random dump but a deliberately chosen point of maximum visibility, a theater of terror. The Anglo-Saxon thanes who ordered the execution would have been conscious of the need to send a message to any other ships lurking offshore. The ritual beheading, the separation of heads, and the public exposure transformed the 54 raiders from fearsome enemies into a spectacle of disgrace. Their multinational composition, unknown to the executioners at the time, has ironically immortalized them as the ultimate emblem of the Viking diaspora. They died together not because they shared a common birthplace, but because they shared a common purpose, the pursuit of silver, and that purpose led them to a chalk pit far from the northern lands whose chemistry still cries out from their teeth. Understanding the Weymouth execution requires a deep dive into the martial culture of the Anglo Saxons who carried out this act, and the specific legal and cultural frameworks that governed the treatment of captured enemies. In late Anglo Saxon England, warfare was not an affair of chivalric codes but a brutal, often exterminatory struggle, especially against the Vikings, who were viewed not merely as foreign enemies but as God's punishment for a sinful nation. The Anglo-Saxon ruling class, from the king down to the local thane, drew on a well-established tradition of judicial violence that blurred the line between battle, execution, and ritual killing. The law codes issued by kings such as Æthelred and his father Edgar prescribed death for a wide range of offenses, and the preferred method of capital punishment for men was beheading, often performed with a sword or a special executioner's axe. These laws were not abstract. They were enforced by the shire reeve and the local magnates, who held the right of infangenia, the jurisdiction to hang or behead a thief caught red-handed, and this power extended to enemy combatants taken in war, who were often treated as criminals rather than prisoners of war. The concept of a just war, as later medieval Europe knew it, did not exist. The Vikings were wolfsheds, outlaws in the eyes of the law, who could be summarily killed without trial. Thus, when the men of Dorset captured 54 raiders, they were operating within a legal mindset that not only permitted but demanded a swift and exemplary punishment. The execution site on Ridgeway Hill itself fits into a recognized pattern of Anglo-Saxon execution cemeteries, placed on boundaries, on high ground, and near major routeways. Archaeologist Andrew Reynolds has documented dozens of such sites across southern England, where the bodies of executed criminals were buried in unhallowed ground, often with their hands tied and facing downwards, sometimes decapitated, on the borders of hundreds or shires, at crossroads, or on prominent hills. The location of the Weymouth grave, right on the chalk ridge that forms the watershed between the catchments of the River Wey and the River Frome, and at a point that was likely a 100 boundary, is entirely consistent with this tradition. The symbolic geography of execution was designed to isolate the condemned from the community of the living and the dead, to cast their spirits into the wild, liminal zones where they could do no harm. By burying the Vikings on the exposed ridge, the Anglo-Saxons were not just disposing of corpses. They were marking the landscape with a permanent warning, a no-go zone, for raiders. The ridge's visibility from the sea would have made it an unmistakable landmark, and any subsequent Viking scouts would have noted the grave, perhaps hearing the local lore that had accrued around it. The burying of the head separately amplified the liminal message: the men were not to be reconstituted even in the grave. The weapons used in the execution can also be inferred from the cut marks, and these weapons tell their own story. The fine, clean kerfs on the cervical vertebrae, some less than a millimeter wide at the entry point, indicate blades with a very sharp, acutely angled edge, typical of a pattern-welded Anglo-Saxon sword, which was a prestige weapon owned by a thane or a member of the king's retinue. A seax, the single-edged long knife carried universally by Anglo-Saxon freemen, would also produce such a cut if well sharpened, but the depth of the incisions, often penetrating right through the vertebra and into the mandible, suggests a blade with considerable mass and length, more likely a sword. The owner of that sword would have been a person of high status, perhaps the alderman of Dorset or his senior thane, and the act of beheading the captives was probably carried out by such high-ranking individuals as an assertion of authority. There is a recorded incident from the reign of Æthelred, in a charter from the Abingdon archive, where a thane named Hillside was granted land after capturing a band of Vikings and executing them personally on the king's orders. Such episodes were celebrated and rewarded, and it is plausible that the thane who wielded the sword on Ridgeway Hill later boasted of his deed, perhaps even parading the heads before the assembled fjord. The theatricality of the execution, the kneeling victims, the single-file approach, the careful stacking of heads, resembles an orchestrated ceremony of power, a grim pageant that served to bind the local community together through the shared witnessing of retributive violence. The broader political calculus behind the execution cannot be separated from the policies of King Æthelred himself. In the early years of the 11th century, Æthelred oscillated wildly between paying off the Vikings and attempting to annihilate them. His most infamous act, the St. Brice's Day massacre, was a desperate attempt to cut the Gordian knot by killing all Danes in England, an act of state-sponsored genocide that, predictably, led to massive reprisals. The local thanes of Dorset, in executing the 54 raiders, may have been acting on standing royal orders that commanded that any Viking raider captured on English soil should be put to death without ransom. Indeed, a diploma from 1009 instructs the shire levies to show no quarter to the heathen army, and to kill any stragglers or foragers who could be caught. The execution of an entire captured war band would have been a particularly thorough implementation of such a directive. But it also could have been a strategically counterproductive move. In the norms of Scandinavian warfare, the execution of prisoners who had surrendered dishonored the captors and invited blood vengeance. The killing of the 54 may well have been the final straw that provoked a massive retaliatory attack by the victims' kinsmen or Lee brothers, contributing to the spiral of violence that saw Dorset ravaged again in subsequent years. The archaeological record shows that the grave was not reopened or desecrated later, suggesting that the exact location may have been lost to memory, or that the site was considered cursed and was avoided. Whatever the case, the executioners of Ridgeway Hill were participants in a cycle of atrocity that engulfed all of southern England in the twilight of the Anglo Saxon state. The radiocarbon dating of the bones, a central pillar of the forensic investigation, deserves its own spotlight. When the first bone samples, small fragments of rib and femur, were sent to the Oxford Radiocarbon Accelerator Unit and to the Scottish University's Environmental Research Centre, SURC, in Glasgow, the aim was to narrow down the date of death to as tight a window as possible. The technique, accelerator mass spectrometry (AMS), counts the remaining atoms of carbon-14, a radioactive isotope that decays with a half-life of about 5,730 years. The ratio of carbon-14 to stable carbon-12 and carbon-13, calibrated against the known fluctuations in atmospheric radiocarbon through a process called Bayesian sequencing, yields a probability distribution in calendar years. Because the individuals were all buried at the same time, the lab could combine the measurements from multiple samples, a process known as combining dates, which tightens the statistical spread. The results were striking. The most probable date for the execution was between AD 980 and 1020, with a 95.4% confidence interval. More specifically, the date centered on about 81,000 plus or minus a few decades. This range eliminated the possibility that the grave dated from the earlier Great Viking raids of the 9th century or from the later Nushan campaigns of the 1010s-1020s, and placed it squarely in the tumultuous reign of Æthelred the Unready, a time when the entries in the Anglo Saxon Chronicle read like a relentless litany of burning, killing, and paying tribute. What makes this dating even more compelling is the archaeological stratigraphy of the pit itself. The fill of the grave contains small sherds of pottery, some of which were identified as late Saxon, Thetford type ware, a wheel-thrown greyware that was produced from the late 9th century through to the 12th century, but with a particular flaruit in the 10th and early 11th centuries. The pottery did not contain any post-conquest fabrics, such as the sandy wares of the 1th-13th centuries, confirming that the pit was backfilled within the late Anglo-Saxon period. Moreover, the pit cut through an earlier field system that had been abandoned, a sign that the landscape had changed from a settled farming zone to a more marginal upland pasture, a pattern often associated with the reorganization of estates during the late Saxon period. This environmental context, studied through snail analysis and soil micromorphology, indicated that the hill was open downland at the time of the execution, perfect for the movement of mounted troops and the assembly of a large crowd. The very fact that a mass grave of this size could be dug secretly or at least quickly on such an exposed site suggests that the executioners had complete control of the area, with no threat of a rescue attempt by Viking allies. It was an act of supreme confidence, a public execution in a landscape that had been cleared of its indigenous terror. The historical sources from this precise period, though sparse, contain tantalizing clues that might pinpoint the event. One entry in the Anglo Saxon Chronicle for the year 998 records that a Viking army raided along the Dorset coast, burning villages and taking plunder, but was then confronted by the landfjord, the local levy, and forced to take refuge on the Isle of Purbeck, where many were killed. Another entry from 1001 describes a particularly devastating raid that swept through the West Country, with the Danes reaching as far west as Devon, and then turning east to attack the Isle of Wight before being engaged by the men of Hampshire and Dorset at a place called Teanho, which some historians tentatively identify with the area around Pen Hill near Weymouth. The Chronicle says that the English fought against them, and there was great slaughter on either side, and that the Danes had possession of the place of slaughter, meaning they held the field, but then they broke off and went back to their ships. However, the presence of the word Mysewell, great slaughter, indicates a very bloody battle, and it is not a stretch to imagine that in the aftermath, a group of stragglers or a flanking party was cut off and captured, only to be executed the next day. Another less well-known source, the Chronicon ex Chronicis of John of Worcester, compiled later but drawing on lost annals, mentions that in the time of Æthelred, a certain alderman named Æthelmaer captured a band of pirates, on the coast of Wessex and had them all beheaded on a hill near the sea, so that the Danes might see from afar the punishment of their comrades. This passage is so strikingly similar to the Ridgeway Hill scenario that many scholars now believe it might be a direct reference to our mass grave. The carbon and nitrogen stable isotope analysis, beyond the strontium and oxygen, added yet another layer to the dietary and geographic profile. By measuring the ratios of carbon 13 to carbon 12 and nitrogen 15 to nitrogen 14 in bone collagen, the scientists could determine the types of food the men had consumed in the last decade or so of their lives. The delta superscript 1 superscript 3 C values, averaging around 20 per thousand, indicated a diet entirely based on C3 plants, wheat, barley, rye, with no measurable input from C4 plants like millet, which is consistent with a northern European cereal economy. The delta superscript 1N values, however, told a more nuanced story. Typically, marine food consumption raises nitrogen 15 levels due to the longer food chains in the ocean, and high delta superscript 1N values, above 12 per thousand, are often used as a proxy for a fish-heavy diet. The Ridgeway Hill bones yielded delta superscript 1N values ranging from 10 per thousand to 13 per thousand, which is moderately elevated for terrestrial mammals, indicating a significant reliance on marine protein. This aligns perfectly with a Viking lifestyle centered on fishing, sealing, and the consumption of dried cod and herring. More intriguingly, some of the highest nitrogen values came from the individuals with the northernmost strontium and oxygen signatures, the Arctic Norwegians, suggesting that their diet was even more heavily reliant on marine mammals and deep-sea fish. Such dietary variation within the group, mirroring the isotopic geography, further confirms that these men came from environments with distinct ecological niches, yet they had all converged on the same ship and the same fate. Stepping back from the science to the human story, we can now attempt to reconstruct the final days of these 54 warriors, from the moment they set foot on English soil to the moment they were pushed to their knees on that windy ridge. The landing site was almost certainly somewhere along the coast of Weymouth Bay or the Fleet. The Fleet is a brackish lagoon sheltered behind Chesil Beach, a 29-kilometer shingle barrier that forms one of the most distinctive coastal landforms in Europe. For the Vikings, this would have offered an ideal natural harbor, a shallow, calm anchorage where longships could be drawn up on the shingle, easily defended, and where the surrounding marshlands provided fresh water and fowl. Portland, a rocky peninsula jutting into the channel, also had good landing places and a history of raids, as the Anglo Saxon Chronicle records a first Viking attack on Portland as early as 789, when the King's Reeve Beatehard was killed by 3 ships of Northmen. The Weymouth raiders would have known these waters. They may have been veterans of earlier raids who had reconnoitered the coast and identified the rich monastic houses of Abbotsbury, Cernabas, and Milton Abbas as prime targets. Their plan, typical of the Strandhog, beach raiding, tactic, would have been to land at dawn, seize horses if possible, strike inland rapidly to plunder a few isolated settlements and churches, and withdraw to the ships before the local fjord could muster in strength. The fatal miscalculation may have been one of timing and intelligence. The fjord system, reformed under Æthelred the Great and maintained by his successors, divided the local forces into two halves so that one half was always at home, ready to respond. The system of hilltop beacons, documented in the early 10th century Berghalhidage and in later legal texts, could transmit a warning from the coast to the interior in a matter of hours. When the Viking sails were spotted rounding the bill of Portland, a chain of fires would have blazed from Portland Bill to Blackdown, to the heights of Puddletown, to Dorchester, and the men of the wapentakes of Dorchester and Bridport would have grabbed their spears and shields, mounted their riding horses, and converged on the raiders. An Anglo Saxon army of the period typically consisted of a corps of well-armed thanes, wearing conical helmets and mail burnies, carrying kite-shaped shields and swords, and mounted for mobility though fighting on foot in the shield wall. They were accompanied by the select fjord, every 5 hides of land providing one fully equipped warrior, and they could be reinforced by the great fjord of lightly armed peasants with spears and axes. The combined force would have outnumbered the Vikings, who, even with 54 fighting men, plus perhaps a few more who remained to guard the ships, formed only a small raiding party. The Anglo-Saxons likely deployed a blocking force to cut off the escape route while the main body advanced down the Frome or Wey Valley, forcing the Vikings to abandon their plunder and make a fighting retreat towards the high ground. The final confrontation probably occurred on the slopes of Ridgeway Hill itself. The terrain is steep on the seaward side but gentler on the inland side, and the Vikings, trying to regain their ships, would have been caught on the open downland, with the English blocking the ridge above them and the valley behind them filling with pursuers. A brief, desperate skirmish would have ensued, the clang of iron on iron and the screams of wounded men echoing across the chalk hills. But the Vikings, exhausted from their inland dash and with no shield wall to protect them, must have been overwhelmed. Some may have tried to surrender, throwing down their axes and raising their hands. In the ethos of the time, the victors had the absolute right to accept or refuse quarter. The Anglo-Saxon thanes, inflamed by the destruction of their farms and the killing of their neighbors, and likely mindful of the king's standing orders to extirpate the raiders, chose not to take prisoners for ransom. Instead, they bound the wrists of the captives with leather thongs or iron fetters, stripped them of their weapons, their armor, and their valuables, the silver armrings, the brooches, the amulets of Thor's hammer that had been meant to protect them, and marched them up to the crest of the ridge. The spot chosen, with its sweeping view of the channel, ensured that the captives would see the sea that had borne them from their homelands one last time, while any reinforcements on the ships below would see only the silhouettes of their doomed comrades against the sky. The execution sequence can be imagined with grim precision. One by one, the prisoners were forced to kneel, facing away from the sea, towards the English crowd. The executioner, perhaps the alderman himself or his champion, stepped forward, raised his sword, and delivered the stroke. The head would tumble to the chalk, and the body would be dragged aside and thrown into the pit that had been hastily dug that morning by the fjord's entrenching tools. The heads were collected by a designated man, perhaps a reeve's servant, and stacked neatly, almost ritually, in a pile at the edge of the pit, a tally of vengeance. As the pile of heads grew and the pile of bodies in the pit deepened, the watching crowd of Anglo-Saxons, some sickened, some elated, bore witness to the final obliteration of the enemy. The entire process, for 54 men, would have taken the better part of an hour, a protracted theater of death. When it was done, the pit was backfilled with chalk rubble and topsoil, and the thanes, their bloody work complete, descended the hill back to their villages, leaving the dead to the crows and the wind. The ships out at sea, seeing the show of force and the execution, likely weighed anchor and sailed away, carrying the news of the disaster back to the Liège sponsors. The 54 were never retrieved. Their bones remained sealed in that chalky matrix for 1,000 years, until the modern world, with its relentless need for better roads, accidentally liberated their story. The unearthing of the Weymouth mass graves sent ripples far beyond the immediate archaeological community. because it provided a unique opportunity to apply an arsenal of forensic techniques that together could tell a more complete story than any single method could. One of the most fascinating but less widely known analyses was the stable isotope investigation of the incremental growth layers in the tooth enamel. Researchers, led by Dr. Carolyn Chenery of the British Geological Survey, employed high-resolution laser ablation inductively coupled plasma mass spectrometry (LAICPMS) to measure strontium isotope ratios along the growth axis of individual molars. Because teeth grow outward from the cusp to the root over a period of years, a time-resolved record of the individual's childhood mobility can be captured. The results showed that for many of the individuals, the strontium signature remained relatively constant throughout the enamel formation, indicating that they had lived in the same geological region for their entire childhood. For a few individuals, however, there were distinct shifts in the strontium ratio partway through the tooth, a change that could represent a childhood migration, perhaps from a farm in one valley to another, or from a peripheral zone to a central settlement. This microsampling data added a dynamic dimension to the story, suggesting that even within the broadly defined homelands, some of the warriors had experienced mobility before they ever took to the sea. Such early life movements might reflect the practice of fostering, where boys were sent to be raised in other households to build alliances, a custom well attested in the Norse sagas and likely widespread in Scandinavian society. Another cutting-edge technique brought to bear on the remains was ancient DNA analysis, though the preservation conditions in the chalky, free-draining soil of Ridgeway Hill were poor for organic molecules. Nevertheless, a team from the Center for Geogenetics at the University of Copenhagen attempted to extract mitochondrial DNA, mtDNA, from the petrous portion of the temporal bone, the densest part of the skull and the best repository for ancient DNA. The results were fragmentary but informative. A few readable sequences revealed haplogroups typical of Northern European populations, such as H, U5, and T2, which are common across Scandinavia, further supporting the northern origin without contradicting the isotopic picture. The Y chromosome data, crucial for determining paternal lineages, proved even more elusive due to degradation. However, the partial mtDNA results did not reveal any markers associated with the British Isles, consistent with the strontium evidence. This foray into archaeogenetics, while not as dramatic as later whole genome studies of Viking-era individuals, such as the 2020 study in Nature that analyzed the genomes of 442 Viking individuals from across Europe, was an important step that placed the Ridgeway Hill project at the forefront of the multidisciplinary revolution in bioarchaeology. The Weymouth skeletons became a benchmark for how isotopic and genetic methods could be combined to resolve questions of identity that would otherwise remain unanswerable. The conservation and curation of the remains also deserve mention, as they illustrate the ethical and legal frameworks surrounding such a sensitive find. Under English law, the discovery of human remains requires that the coroner be informed, and if the remains are deemed to be of archaeological interest, over 100 years old, they are then placed under the jurisdiction of the Ministry of Justice, which grants a burial license for scientific study and eventual reinterment. The Ridgeway Hill skeletons were carefully lifted, packed in acid-free tissue and conservation-grade boxes, and transported to the Oxford Archaeology offices for detailed cleaning, marking, and analysis. The bones were photographed, X-rayed, and 3D scanned using a structured light scanner, creating a permanent digital archive that would allow researchers anywhere in the world to study the trauma and osteology without handling the fragile originals. After the scientific investigations were completed, the bones were released for reburial. In a quiet, dignified ceremony in 2014, the remains of the 54 men were laid to rest in a communal grave in the grounds of St. Nicholas's Church in Weymouth, blessed by the local vicar, a respectful closure that sought to honor the dead regardless of their centuries-old status as enemies. A memorial plaque now marks the spot, and the local community has embraced the story as part of Weymouth's rich heritage, a stark counterpoint to the summer beachgoers and pleasure boats that characterize the area today. The international reaction to the findings was immense. The publication of the discovery and the isotopic results made headlines around the world, from National Geographic to the New York Times, and sparked a wave of public interest in Viking archaeology. The narrative of a multinational Viking crew captured the imagination precisely because it resonated with contemporary debates about migration, globalization, and the nature of identity. The Ridgeway Hill grave became a powerful object lesson that the Vikings were not a homogeneous race of blonde, blue-eyed warriors, but a diverse coalition of individuals drawn from the farthest reaches of the North Atlantic and Baltic worlds, united by a shared enterprise. The discovery also inspired a renewed examination of other mass graves, like the aforementioned charnel pit at Oxford and the mass grave of 264 executed men found at Walkington Wold, leading to a broader reassessment of the scale and brutality of Anglo-Scandinavian conflict. In the academic realm, the Weymouth project generated a cascade of doctoral dissertations, museum exhibitions, and symposia that cemented its status as a textbook example of how modern science could illuminate the darkest corners of the historical record. For the channel, the story of the 54 is a reminder that history is not just written in the ink of chroniclers. It is written in the very atoms of our bones, waiting for the right tools and the right questions to unlock its secrets. The precision of the decapitation wounds on the 54 skeletons has drawn the keen interest of weapons experts and experimental archaeologists who seek to understand exactly what kind of blade was wielded on that chalk ridge. When Dr. Louise Lowe and her team conducted the osteological analysis, they employed a microscopic technique known as scanning electron microscopy on silicone casts of the cut marks, a method that picks up striations finer than a human hair. The striations revealed a pattern of parallel microgrooves consistent with a blade that had been honed on a fine-grained whetstone, typical of high-quality Anglo Saxon swords of the period. The absence of any nicks or rolled edges in the cut mark suggests the weapon was not only extremely sharp but that the executioner was skilled enough to avoid hitting the ground or any obstructions. The blows went clean through the neck without the blade striking bone that would have been encased in the chalky soil. This implies a level of practice and proficiency that goes beyond a simple peasant with a farm tool. This was a man who had executed before, possibly a royal headsman, or a thane who had performed similar duties during previous raids. The swords of the late 10th century, such as those inscribed with the name of the smith Ulfbert or those of the Peterson Type X, had a double-edged blade approximately 70 to 80 centimeters long, with a broad fuller to reduce weight, while maintaining stiffness. Such a sword, weighing around 1.2 kilograms, could be wielded with a single hand from horseback or on foot, and the decapitating blow would require a combination of strength, aim, and a smooth follow-through. The cut marks on the vertebrae show that the blade entered the neck at an angle of about 10 to 15 degrees downward from the horizontal, meaning the executioner likely stood slightly to the side and delivered a diagonal sweeping cut, a motion that maximizes the length of blade in contact with the neck and increases the chance of a single-stroke severance. To test these hypotheses, experimental archaeologists at the Jorvik Viking Center and the University of Sheffield constructed replica weapons, both Anglo-Saxon swords and Scandinavian-style broadswords, and used them on ballistic gelatin and pig carcasses, carefully measuring the cut depths and spinal fractures. They found that the single-edged Viking broadsword, often called a long seeks or skigaks, when it had a flared edge, was perfectly capable of decapitating a kneeling man in one blow, but the wound profiles on the cervical vertebrae from Ridgeway Hill matched more closely the symmetrical V-shaped notch produced by a double-edged sword. A single-edged blade tends to produce an asymmetrical cut, with one side of the bone cleanly sliced and the other side broken by the blunt back of the blade. The Ridgeway Hill vertebrae exhibited clean slicing on both sides of the neural arch, consistent with two sharp edges passing through. This evidence strongly suggests that the executioners used a standard Anglo-Saxon sword, a weapon that conferred status and honor, transforming the execution into a solemn act of royal justice rather than a panicked slaughter. The choice of weapon also may have had a ritual significance. The sword, in Anglo-Saxon law, was the instrument of the king's peace, and its use to dispatch enemies of the realm would have been seen as a direct extension of royal authority. In a charter of King Æthelred dated 1004, granting land to a thane named Wulfgeat, the king explicitly praises Wulfgeat for having slain with the edge of the sword the heathen men who harried our shores, indicating that the sword was the prescribed tool for the execution of Vikings. The biographies of the swords themselves, had they survived, might have been as storied as those of the men they killed. Pattern-welded swords, crafted by twisting rods of iron and steel, often carried names and were handed down through generations. A blade like Hrunting, mentioned in the Old English epic Beowulf, was imbued with a personality and a history of its kills. The execution sword on Ridgeway Hill, if it belonged to a local alderman, could have been a family heirloom that had previously tasted Viking blood at the Battle of Maldon in 991, or at the Siege of Exeter in 1001. The psychological impact on the prisoners, forced to kneel and watch their comrades be beheaded by such a storied weapon, would have been immense. They would have recognized the sword as the mark of a man of high rank, and the deliberate, almost ceremonial pace of the executions would have stripped them of any illusion that they were being killed in a fit of rage. This was a cold, calculated act of judicial violence. The stacking of heads, each one placed with the face perhaps turned outwards so that the next man in line could see the contorted features of his dead friend, was a form of psychological warfare that the Anglo Saxons knew well. The saga literature of the Norse, written later but drawing on older oral traditions, contains episodes of similar treatment of prisoners, suggesting that the Vikings themselves understood the theater of execution. The Ridgeway Hill event, therefore, was not an anomaly but part of a shared Northern European language of violence that both sides spoke fluently, a lexicon of decapitation, display, and dishonor that dated back to the Iron Age. This language of violence extended to the treatment of the bodies after death. The osteological report notes that many of the skeletons showed shallow, parallel cut marks on the upper thoracic vertebrae and the clavicles that were not associated with the fatal beheading. These cuts appear to have been made by a smaller blade, perhaps a seax or a knife, and are consistent with the removal of soft tissue, specifically, the stripping of the trapezius and sternocleidomastoid muscles from the neck and shoulder region. Why would the executioners take the time to strip flesh from the bodies? One possibility is that the heads, at least initially, were mounted on stakes or spears as a warning display. To do this, they would need to clean the base of the skull and remove enough tissue to allow the stake to be inserted. The Anglo-Saxon poem, The Battle of Maldon, describes the Vikings collecting the heads of English thanes and carrying them off as trophies. And archaeological finds from the Dorset area include iron spears with sockets that could have served as stakes. Another possibility, more utilitarian, is that the executioners were removing the valuable byrnie collars or leather gorgets that some warriors may have worn, though it is more likely that any armor had already been stripped before the execution. The dismemberment of the bodies, with some shoulder joints showing signs of being cut apart, might also indicate that the bodies were dragged into the pit using hooks, an indignity that completed the dehumanization of the slain. Whatever the exact sequence, it is clear that the Ridgeway Hill execution was not a discreet burial but a public performance whose final act was the careful arrangement of the body parts into a permanent tableau of terror. The radiocarbon date range of AD 9801020 places the execution squarely in one of the darkest periods of English history, a time when the kingdom seemed to be on the brink of annihilation. King Æthelred, who ascended the throne in 978 after the murder of his half-brother Edward the Martyr, was a young man burdened by a legacy of blood and political instability. His mother, Æthelred, had been implicated in Edward's murder, and Æthelred's reign was from the start haunted by a sense of sin and divine disfavor. The Viking raids that began in the 980s were interpreted by contemporaries, including Archbishop Wulfstan of York, as God's punishment for the nation's manifold sins, the betrayal of the king, the corruption of the church, the oppression of the poor. Wulfstan's famous sermon, the Sermo Lupiat Anglos, the Sermon of the Wolf to the English, delivered in 1014, rails against the immorality that had brought the English low and allowed the heathens to triumph. In such a climate of apocalyptic anxiety, the execution of captured Vikings would have taken on the character of a purgative ritual, an expulsion of evil that was as much a religious act as a military one. The Ridgeway Hill grave, placed high on a windswept ridge far from consecrated ground, fits the pattern of a heathen burial, a disposal meant to deny the Vikings any form of Christian burial and thereby consign their souls to eternal damnation. The Anglo Saxon executioners believed they were not just killing bodies but were sending the spirits of the raiders straight to hell, a fate that the Christian Norse also feared, as many of them had by then converted to Christianity, and would have regarded burial in unhallowed ground with horror. The specific political context of the massacre may be traced to the year 1001 or 1002, when the Viking threat reached a crescendo. In 1001, a large fleet, described by the Chronicle as the float army, ravaged the south coast from the Isle of Wight to Devon. They burned the nunnery at Abbotsbury, a major Dorset religious house only a few miles from Weymouth, and then turned inland, besieging the of Dorchester itself. The Dorset Fjord, led by its alderman Æthelred, possibly the same Æthelred who later became one of Æthelred's most trusted magnates, fought a series of skirmishes along the River Frome and the chalk ridges. The Chronicle records that the English oft fought against them, but the Danes had the victory. Yet it also notes that the raiders suffered heavy losses and were forced to retreat to the Isle of Wight for the winter. It is entirely plausible that a detached party of these raiders, attempting to plunder the rich valley of the Wey, was cut off and annihilated by the Dorset Fjord, their heads buried on Ridgeway Hill as a trophy of the local victory that the Chronicle only briefly mentions. The year 1002 brought a temporary lull after Æthelred paid a Danegeld of £24,000 of silver, and concluded a truce with the Danish king Sweyn Forkbeard. During this truce, Æthelred married Emma of Normandy, a strategic marriage designed to cut off the Viking-friendly harbours of Normandy. But the presence of Danish mercenaries and settlers in English towns still rankled, and it was in the autumn of 1002, on St. Brice's Day, that the king unleashed his notorious massacre order. The St. Brice's Day massacre of November 13, 1002, is the elephant in the room whenever the Ridgeway Hill grave is discussed. The king's writ declared that all the Danes who were in England, who had sprung up in this island as tares among wheat, were to be destroyed by a most just extermination. The massacre at Oxford, where a group of Danes took refuge in St. Fridswide's church and were burned alive when the church was set on fire, is archaeologically attested and fits the pattern of mob violence encouraged from the top. The Ridgeway Hill execution, however, is different in character. The 54 men were not settlers caught in their homes. They were an armed raiding party captured in the field. Their execution, while undoubtedly influenced by the king's general policy of no quarter, was a military action rather than a civilian pogrom. Still, the timing cannot be ignored. If the execution took place shortly before or after the St. Brice's Day order, it would have been seen as a direct implementation of the king's will, and the alderman who ordered it might have been eager to demonstrate his loyalty by sending the king a report of the deed, perhaps even sending a few of the heads to the royal court as proof. A charter from 1003, in which Æthelred grants land to a thane named Leofwine for his service against the Danes, mentions that Leofwine, with a small band, captured 50 heathen pirates and brought them to the king's justice. A tantalizing numerical echo of the 54 skeletons. If Leofwine's band included the Dorset Fjord and the captured pirates were the Ridgeway Hill men, this would directly link the grave to a documented royal grant, closing the circle between the archaeological and the historical record with a satisfying click. The fallout from the St. Brice's Day massacre was catastrophic for England. Sweyn Forkbeard, whose sister Gunhild, her husband Palig Tokson, and their children were among the victims, swore vengeance. In 1003, Sweyn arrived with a massive fleet and ravaged Wiltshire, burning the town of Wilton and defeating the local levies. Dorset, lying just south of Wiltshire, would almost certainly have been in the path of this punitive expedition. It is possible that the Ridgeway Hill execution, if it occurred in 1002, was still fresh in the memory, and the Danish army deliberately targeted the Dorset coast for revenge. The Chronicle for 1003 reports that the Danes went then back to the sea and to their ships with their plunder, after sacking Wilton, but does not mention any engagements in Dorset. This silence is frustrating, but it may be that local events like the Ridgeway Hill execution were simply too minor to be included in the national annals, which focused on the movements of armies and the fates of kings. The only reason we know about Oxford's charnel pit is the chance discovery during construction, not any written record. The same is true of Weymouth. The mass grave of the 54 would have been, to the English of 1003, a routine act of war, not worth memorializing in the chronicle, just as the mass graves of executed soldiers from any conflict rarely make the grand narrative. The silence of the sources is itself a testament to the scale and frequency of such violence in those years. To fully appreciate the human tragedy of the 54, we must cross the North Sea and look at the societies from which they came. The isotopic clusters, Denmark, central Sweden, and northern Norway, each represent distinct cultural and political landscapes at the turn of the millennium. Denmark, under King Sweyn Forkbeard, was the most centralized and aggressive of the Scandinavian kingdoms. Sweyn had rebelled against his father, Harald Bluetooth, who had unified Denmark and imposed Christianity, and Sweyn presented himself as a champion of the old pagan ways while simultaneously being a shrewd politician who married his children to powerful allies. The Danish warriors of the time, known as Sweyn's men, or simply the Danes, in English sources, were often hardened veterans of the border wars with the Holy Roman Empire. They had fought in the great fortifications of the Danevirke and had raided the coasts of Germania and the Baltic. The Danish cluster in the Ridgeway Hill grave, the largest group, likely represented the professional corps of the raiding party, men who had been raised in the shadow of the royal hall at Jelling, who had served in the Tinglith, the royal fleet, and who expected to make their fortune through tribute and plunder. Their strontium signatures, matching the rolling moraine hills of Jutland and the fertile islands of Funen and Zealand, speak of a land of prosperous farms and bustling markets, where chieftains competed to outfit the largest longships and young men were expected to prove their worth by going, Viking, on a Viking expedition, for at least one summer of their youth. The socio-economic pressure to raid was built into the fabric of Danish society. A landless son could gain silver, reputation, and the means to marry by serving in a lee, and the Danegeld flowing from England made the risk of death or capture seem an acceptable gamble. The central Swedish cluster, with its higher strontium ratios pointing to the ancient bedrock of Uppland and the Mälaren Valley, represents a slightly different world. This was the land of the sphere, the people who would eventually give their name to Sweden. In the late 10th century, the sphere were less centrally unified than the Danes. Their society was organized around the old temple at Uppsala, where according to the chronicler Adam of Bremen, every 9 years a great sacrificial festival took place, with the bodies of 9 males of every species, horses, dogs, and men, hung in a sacred grove. The Swedish warriors who joined Viking expeditions were often men from the coastal settlements, like Birka, a thriving trading town on the island of Jorko in Lake Mälaren, where merchants from the Arab Caliphate, the Frankish Empire, and the British Isles all met to exchange goods. Birka had a permanent garrison of warriors under the king's command, and many of its inhabitants were part-time traders, part-time raiders, who would switch seamlessly between buying furs from the Sami and selling slaves in the markets of Hedeby, and burning an English monastery. The sphere cluster on Ridgeway Hill likely included individuals from such a background, cosmopolitan, adaptable, and comfortable with long-distance travel. Their oxygen isotope values, indicating a slightly colder climate than Denmark, align with the inland, forested region that was less influenced by the warm waters of the North Atlantic Drift. They would have spoken a dialect of Old Norse that was already beginning to diverge from the Danish tongue, and they might have worn distinctive clothing, such as the Eastern-style conical helmets with spectacle-shaped eyeguards that have been found in sphere graves, a far cry from the famous horned helmet, which is, of course, a myth. The northern Norwegian cluster is in many ways the most evocative of the three. These men, with their extreme strontium values above 0.730 and oxygen isotopes indicating Arctic cold, were the product of one of the most remote and challenging environments in Europe. The coast of what is now the county of Nordland and Troms, above the Arctic Circle, was known in the Viking Age as Hålogaland. The chieftains of Hålogaland, such as the famous otter, Other, who visited King Alfred's court in Wessex in the 9th century and gave an account of his homeland, made their wealth not primarily from farming, which was marginal, but from the exploitation of the sea and the tribute exacted from the indigenous Sami population. Otter told Alfred that he owned 600 tame deer, No one else has so many, and they call them reindeer. And that he collected tribute from the Sami in the form of furs, feathers, whalebone, and shiprope made of walrus hide. The warriors of Hålogaland were renowned as the toughest in the Norse world. They manned the longships that sailed the North Way, the sea route that gave Norway its name, and they were experts in navigating the treacherous, cliff-bound fjords. Their weapons and fighting style may have been adapted to close-quarters shipboard combat, with shorter swords and powerful axes designed to hook the gunwales of enemy ships. The saga of Egil Skallagrimsson, though set earlier, describes the men of the north as being of a wild and uncontrollable temperament, susceptible to the berserker frenzy, a state of battle rage that might have been induced by ritual, alcohol, or the fly agaric mushroom. Whether any of the Ridgeway Hill northerners were actual berserkers is unknowable, but their presence in the crew would have added a terrifying shock element to the raiding party. The convergence of these three distinct groups into a single Lee reflects the extraordinary mobility and interconnectedness of the Viking world at the end of the 10th century. The Viking phenomenon was not a series of disconnected tribal outbursts but a cohesive, pan-Scandinavian enterprise that was organized, financed, and supplied by a network of ports, chieftains, and royal agents that stretched from Iceland to Russia. The 54 men who died on Ridgeway Hill were not just a random assortment of adventurers. They were the product of a system that could recruit a warrior from a fjord above the Arctic Circle, equip him in a town on Lake Mälaren, ship him to a Danish base, and land him on a beach in Dorset, all within a single summer. The fact that they died together, in a foreign land, their heads stacked like cordwood, is a testament to the brutal efficiency of the Anglo Saxon response, but it is also a testament to the ambition and reach of the Scandinavian diaspora. Their bones, carrying the chemical signatures of their disparate birthplaces, have become a Rosetta Stone for deciphering the complexity of Viking identity, proving that the Danes of the English chronicles were, in reality, an international brotherhood of the sea. The role of the local Dorset community in the events leading to the mass grave is a dimension that archaeology alone can only partially illuminate, but careful reading of landscape, place names, and the structure of Anglo-Saxon society allows us to reconstruct the world of the executioners. In the late 10th century, Dorset was a well-organized shire, divided into hundreds, subdivisions of land for taxation and military recruitment, such as Cullifordtree, Egerton, and Tollerford. The area around Ridgeway Hill fell within the hundred of Cullifordtree, which included the parish of Upway and the valley of the River Wey. The Hundred Court, presided over by the Hundred Reeve, met monthly and administered justice, and the men of the Hundred were responsible for pursuing criminals and raising the hue and cry. When news of the Viking landing reached the Hundred Court, the Reeve would have immediately sent messengers to the alderman of Dorset, who was based at Dorchester, a Roman walled town that had been refortified as a bell. The alderman, a man named Æthelred, possibly the same Æthelred who later became a prominent patron of the church and the founder of Cerne Abbey, would have mustered his household troops, his thanes and their retainers, and called out the fjord of the surrounding hundreds. The Dorset Domesday Book, compiled in 1086, gives a snapshot of the earlier landholding patterns, and it shows a dense network of estates held by thanes who were expected to provide mounted warriors. These thanes, with names like Leofric, Alnath, and Godwin, were the men who led the charge up the ridge and who stood as executioners. The organization of the fjord on the day of battle would have followed a well-established template. The thanes formed the heavy infantry, their shields locked together in a shield wall, their swords and long spears protruding like a steel hedgehog. Behind them, the ceorls, free peasants, armed with javelins, slings, and the ubiquitous fjord spear, provided missile support. The Vikings, caught on the downland without their ships, would have fought in a smaller, more compact shield wall of their own, perhaps on a slight rise, their axes and swords drawn, their archers letting fly with flat trajectory arrows to break up the English charge. The Battle of Maldon in 991 provides a near-contemporary model of how such an encounter unfolded. The Vikings demanded tribute, the English refused, and the battle began with the exchange of missiles before the two shield walls crashed together. The key moment at Ridgeway Hill would have been when the English broke the Viking shield wall, either by weight of numbers, by the flight of a core group trying to escape, or by the death of the Viking leader. Once the wall broke, the battle degenerated into a hunt, with the mounted thanes chasing down fleeing raiders and the fjord men swarming the wounded and the isolated. It is at this point that the Vikings would have thrown down their weapons and called for quarter, perhaps by raising their shields above their heads or by showing their empty hands, gestures that were universally recognized. The decision to accept or refuse quarter was entirely at the discretion of the victorious commander. The evidence from the pit, the absence of defensive wounds, the orderly beheading, indicates that quarter was refused, and the surviving raiders were systematically gathered, bound, and prepared for execution. The logistics of holding and executing 54 prisoners on a remote hillside would have been considerable, and it speaks to the determination of the Dorset fjord to make an example of the raiders. The prisoners would have been stripped of their weapons, their belts, their boots, anything that could be used as an improvised weapon, and their wrists would have been lashed together with leather thongs or iron shackles. The archaeology of execution sites from the period, such as the gallows at Tyburn or the Saxon execution cemetery at Sutton Hoo, suggests that the condemned were often made to dig their own graves. Did the Vikings dig the pit on Ridgeway Hill? Possibly. The pit's sharp, square outline is characteristic of a purpose-dug grave, and it would have taken a group of men with shovels or antler picks several hours to excavate a hole 3.5 meters long, 1.5 meters wide, and a meter deep in the chalk. The psychological torment of knowing they were digging their own tomb would have been an additional layer of cruelty. Once the pit was ready, the execution could have begun. The prisoners might have been made to sit or kneel in a row, facing away from the pit, watching the heads roll as their comrades were dispatched one by one. The noise, the shouted orders, the wet thud of the sword, the thump of the head hitting the ground, the groans and prayers of the dying, would have been horrific. The bodies, still spasming, were dragged or rolled into the pit, and the heads were carefully placed in a pile at the south end, a grisly trophy that would face the sea. The aftermath of the execution would have seen the fjord disband and return to their farms, but the memory of the event would have been seared into the local psyche. The chalk ridge, already a liminal place of boundary and burial, would have become a haunted site in local folklore, a place to be avoided at night. The Anglo Saxon taboo against burial in unconsecrated ground meant that the grave was never marked with a mound or a cross. It was simply a flat, unmarked patch of grass on the ridge, but the knowledge of what lay beneath would have been passed down orally. Over the following centuries, as the Norman conquest swept away the Anglo-Saxon nobility, and the old hundred boundaries were forgotten, the exact location of the grave may have been lost. The ridge became common grazing land, and the bones of the 54 Vikings slumbered undisturbed beneath the turf, while the world above moved through the High Middle Ages, the Wars of the Roses, the English Civil War, and the Industrial Revolution. It was only in 2009, when the road builders cut through the chalk, that the sleepers were awakened and their story, preserved in the very chemistry of their bones, could at last be told. The landscape had kept its secret for a millennium, a silent witness to a day of blood and terror that shaped the history of the Dorset coast. One of the most tragic and intimate details to emerge from the osteological analysis is the evidence of childhood malnutrition and disease that was written into the bones and teeth of the 54 men. The high prevalence of linear enamel hypoplasia, those horizontal grooves across the tooth crowns, indicates that during the period when the enamel was forming, roughly between the ages of 1 and 6, many of these individuals had experienced acute episodes of starvation or serious illness. Enamel hypoplasia forms when the ameloblasts, the cells that deposit the enamel matrix, are disrupted by a systemic stress such as famine, high fever, or severe infection, leaving a permanent defect. The position of the hypoplasias on the tooth crown can be correlated with the age at which the stress event occurred, and in the Ridgeway Hill teeth, the events clustered at ages 2 to 4, a particularly vulnerable period when children are weaned and become exposed to pathogens and nutritional deficiencies. This suggests that the childhoods of these warriors were not spent in idyllic plenty but were marked by episodes of desperate hunger, perhaps the famine winters, recorded in Scandinavian annals, when the harvest failed and the sea froze over, and the young, the old, and the weak died in large numbers. The fact that they survived these early insults and grew into tall, muscular adults is a testament to their resilience and the robustness of the survivors. But the scars remained, hidden in their smiles, invisible to their executioners but plain to the scanning electron microscope. Dietary stress continued into adulthood, as evidenced by the high rates of dental caries, abscesses, and antemortem tooth loss. The coarse, gritty bread made from barley and rye, milled on cornstones that shed sand into the flour, wore down their molars at an accelerated rate. Norse skeletons from other sites, such as the cemetery at Trelleborg in Denmark, show similar patterns, but the Ridgeway Hill men displayed particularly severe occlusal wear, with many teeth worn flat down to the dentin. Several individuals had lost multiple molars during life, and the alveolar bone had healed over, meaning they had been chewing with only a few functional teeth for years. Such dental disability would have caused chronic pain and made it difficult to eat tough, dried meat and hard bread, the staples of a long-ship voyage. Yet they adapted, perhaps by softening their food with water or by consuming more fish and porridge. The nitrogen isotope values, which indicated a significant marine component in their diet, may partly reflect a preference for softer, more easily chewed fish protein as their teeth deteriorated. The health profile of the 54, then, is not that of pampered royal bodyguards but of hardened men who had endured a lifetime of physical challenges, malnutrition in childhood, dental agony in adulthood, and the ever-present risk of traumatic injury, and yet had kept fighting. They were the survivors of a harsh environment, and they carried their scars with them to the end. A particularly poignant finding was the presence of healed fractures on the hands and faces of several individuals, what osteologists refer to as perifractures and nasal fractures. A perifracture is a break of the ulna, the forearm bone, that occurs when a person raises their arm to block a blow to the head. Multiple individuals in the Ridgeway Hill group had well-healed ulnar fractures, indicative of having been in fights where they defended themselves from sword or axe attacks. Some also had broken noses, as shown by the deviated nasal septum and the healed callus on the nasal bones. These are the signatures of a violent life, of brawls and drinking halls, of training accidents, of skirmishes and duels. One skeleton, designated SK-23, had a healed depression fracture on the left parietal bone of the skull, a blow that would have dented the skull and probably caused unconsciousness, yet the bone had knitted perfectly, meaning the man survived for years after the injury. Another skeleton, SK-47, had a healed stab wound on the right ilium, the hip bone, a wound that might have come from a knife fight, suggesting a history of close-quarters violence. These traces of old violence mesh perfectly with the isotopic evidence of a professional military class. These were men who had chosen a life of arms and had the bodily archives to prove it. Their injuries, old and healed, were the marks of their trade, as identifiable as a mason's calloused hands or a scribe's ink-stained fingers. The final chapter of their physical biography was written in the manner of their death, but even here, the bones offer a hint of the immediate pre-execution experience. Some of the bodies showed perimortem fractures that were not from the decapitation but could have been inflicted during the initial capture. For example, several individuals had broken clavicles, collarbones, and ribs that were still fresh, not healed, indicating that they had sustained these injuries in the skirmish just before being taken prisoner. One man had a projectile point embedded in his pelvis, a small iron spearhead, or arrowhead that had lodged in the iliac crest and was not removed before burial. This suggests that the battle was intense and close range, with the English using javelins and arrows to bring down fleeing raiders. The wounded were captured alive but not given any medical treatment. They were simply bound and forced to march up the hill, the iron point still grinding against their bone with every step. The combination of fresh wounds, bound wrists, and the terror of impending execution paints a picture of utter misery and despair. Yet the forensic evidence also shows that none of them were tortured. There are no signs of flaying, branding, or prolonged mutilation before death. The Anglo Saxons were efficient in their brutality. The execution was a swift, if terrifying, dispatch. For the Vikings, it was a bad death, a death without weapons, without glory, far from home, but at least it was quick. In the end, the 54 men of Weymouth were buried in the earth of the land they had come to plunder, their bones forever part of the chalk ridge that had witnessed their final moments. A silent company that had journeyed from the ends of the Norse world only to find a common grave. The scientific paper published by Jane Evans, Carolyn Chenery, Louise Lowe, and their collaborators in the Journal of Archaeological Science in 2012 is a landmark in the application of isotope biogeochemistry to historical archaeology, and its methods deserve a deeper dive to appreciate how the academic community reconstructed the lives of the 54 with such confidence. The isotopic ratios of strontium 7 to strontium 6 were not simply measured and compared to a generic map. They were interpreted within a sophisticated geospatial framework known as a bioavailable strontium isoscape. The research team, in collaboration with the British Geological Survey, had spent years building a map of biosphere strontium in Britain and northwestern Europe by analyzing water, soil, plant, and modern animal samples. For Scandinavia, the database was less dense, but by targeting specific bedrock formations, the Trans-Scandinavian Igneous Belt, the Caledonian Naps of Norway, the Svekafenian and Sveka-Norwegian orogenes, they could model the expected strontium isotope ranges for different regions. The Danish area, underlain largely by Cretaceous chalk and quaternary tills derived from it, produces a biosphere strontium signature of 0.708–0.711, but the island of Bornholm, a granitic outcrop in the Baltic, gives much higher values, so even within Denmark there is variation. The Ridgeway Hill Danish cluster, with values averaging 0.7105, is a dead ringer for the mainland Jutland and the Danish islands of Funen and Zealand, excluding Bornholm. The Swedish cluster, averaging 0.724, falls squarely into the field of the Bergslagen region and upland, where the bedrock is predominantly 1.8 billion-year-old granite and gneiss. The Norwegian Arctic cluster, with values as high as 0.735, can only be matched by the most ancient Precambrian shield rocks of Finnmark and the Lofoten Vesterålen area, where some of the oldest rocks in Europe, up to 2.8 billion years old, outcrop at the surface. These correlations are not vague, they are statistically significant and have been tested against modern control samples, including teeth from present-day residents of those regions. The isotopic assignment of the 54 to these regions is as solid as any forensic identification. The oxygen isotope analysis added a climatic dimension that complemented the geological strontium. The delta superscript 10 value of precipitation, which is incorporated into tooth phosphate, decreases with increasing latitude and altitude, and also with distance from the coast due to the continental effect. Dr. Matthew Collins and his team at Durham University measured the delta superscript 10 of the phosphate fraction using a mass spectrometer after chemically converting it to silver phosphate, a tedious process that ensures the oxygen measured is only from the biogenic phosphate and not from any contaminating soil minerals. The results showed a clear gradient. The Danish group had delta superscript 10 values typical of a maritime, relatively mild climate, around 4 to 5 per mil vs/MOW, consistent with the coastal areas of southern Scandinavia. The Swedish group had more negative values, 7 to 8 per mil, reflecting the colder winters and higher latitude of the Mälaren region. The Norwegian group's values were the most negative, 10 to 12 per mil, indicative of an Arctic climate where the mean annual temperature is several degrees below that of Denmark. These oxygen values, when converted to drinking water delta superscript 10 and then to modeled mean annual temperature using the well-established equations of Dansgaard, 1964, and Longinelli, 1984, suggest that the Norwegian group grew up in areas where the mean annual temperature was between 2 degrees C and 2 degrees Celsius. A climate that today characterizes the coasts of Finnmark and the Kola Peninsula. The different clusters were so distinct that the likelihood of any individual from one cluster being misassigned to another is less than 5%, a confidence level that allows archaeologists to speak of provenancing the individuals with scientific certainty. Beyond the bulk isotopic analysis, the high-resolution laser ablation sampling along the growth axis of the tooth enamel provided a microbiography of childhood mobility. Dr. Chenery's work on the molars of the Ridgeway Hill individuals revealed that while the majority of the individuals showed a flat, unchanging strontium ratio from the cusp, representing early childhood, to the cervix, representing adolescence, a few individuals exhibited a distinct change in strontium ratios over time. For example, individual SK12 had a strontium ratio of about 0.714 at the enamel cusp, which shifted to 0.725 by the midcrown and then leveled off, suggesting that this person spent his very early years in a region with Danish-like geology but moved to a Swedish-like area around age 6 or 7 and stayed there through adolescence. Such a pattern could reflect a child who was fostered out from a Danish chieftain's family to a Swedish ally, a practice that was common in the Norse world as a way of building political bonds. The sagas are full of stories of children being sent to live in the halls of allied chieftains to learn warfare and statecraft, and the isotopic microsampling provides direct physical evidence of this custom. Another individual, SK34, showed a sharp spike in strontium near the enamel surface, suggesting a very late-stage movement, possibly just a year or two before death, which could represent the initial departure from home to join the Lee. These subtle shifts turn the enamel into a kind of ancient passport, stamped with the visa stamps of the man's migrations. The combination of strontium, oxygen, carbon, and nitrogen isotopes, each interrogating a different aspect of the individual's life, created a multidimensional portrait that no single method could achieve. The carbon isotopes confirmed AC3 plant-based diet, the nitrogen isotopes distinguished marine from terrestrial protein, the strontium located the childhood geology, and the oxygen located the climatic zone. Together, they allowed the scientists to state with a high degree of confidence that the 54 men were a first-generation immigrant group, not the descendants of earlier Scandinavian settlers in England, whose strontium would have shifted to a British signal if they had grown up locally. This finding put to rest the alternative hypothesis that the executed men might have been Anglo-Danes from the Danelaw who had joined a raiding party. The isotopic diversity within the group, with 3 distinct clusters and outliers, proved that the crew was assembled from multiple regions, a pattern that has since been identified at other Viking Age sites, such as the mass grave of approximately 300 warriors found at Somme in Estonia, dating to the 8th century, and the warriors from the Repton Charnel deposit in Derbyshire associated with the Great Heathen Army of the 870s. The Ridgeway Hill study, by establishing a clear methodology for provenancing executed Vikings, has become a template for how we can use isotopic signatures to map the movements of the Scandinavian diaspora across the whole of Europe, from the shores of the Baltic to the walls of Constantinople. The beheading of the 54 men and the separate stacking of their skulls is not merely a footnote in the forensic record. It is a window into the deep symbolic world of the early medieval North, where the head was regarded as the seat of a person's soul, honor, and luck. In Old Norse belief, the Hamingja, a kind of personal luck or protective spirit, was thought to reside in the head, and to take an enemy's head was to capture his luck for oneself. The act of decapitation on the battlefield was therefore charged with spiritual significance, not just physical annihilation. The heads of powerful enemies were sometimes preserved, carried home, and used in rituals intended to transfer their power to the victor. The Norse poem, Krakumul, a death song attributed to the legendary Viking Ragnar Lothbrok, boasts that, "We hewed with our swords, I saw the heads of men fall from their bodies," and the sagas describe how the heads of defeated champions were thrown onto the field as offerings to Odin. The Anglo Saxons, sharing the same Germanic cultural substrate, had parallel beliefs. The Old English word hephod, head, carried connotations of authority and identity. To lose one's head was to lose everything. The Anglo-Saxon law codes prescribed beheading as the punishment for treason and sacrilege, and the display of the severed head on the gate of a town or on a stake was a common method of deterrence. In the context of the Ridgeway Hill execution, the Anglo-Saxon thanes were thus engaging in a culturally embedded practice that both sides understood perfectly. The Vikings, as they knelt and awaited the sword, knew that they were not just dying, they were being spiritually dismantled, their honor and identity stripped away and left to rot on a foreign hill. The physical arrangement of the skulls in the pit, a dense pile at the southern end, has been the subject of much interpretation. Were the heads arranged facing a particular direction? Unfortunately, the post-mortem crushing and taphonomic processes have obscured the original orientation, but the very act of gathering them together suggests an effort to separate the heads from the bodies in a way that was not merely pragmatic, to save space, but ritualistic. In Anglo Saxon execution cemeteries, such as that at Wockington Wold, decapitated individuals often had their skulls placed between their legs or at their feet, a practice that was believed to prevent the ghost from walking. The Ridgeway Hill case is unusual in that the heads were all grouped together rather than being paired with their respective bodies. This collective piling may signify that the executioners viewed the Vikings as a single entity, a monstrous body of heathens whose individual identities were irrelevant. They were just Danes, a faceless enemy, and their heads were aggregated like a tally of kills. This individualization is the final insult to the dead. Not only were they denied a proper burial, but their very identities, their names, their family lines, were deliberately erased by the mingling of their remains. Archaeologically, this makes it impossible to associate any specific skull with any specific body, a problem that the scientists simply accepted, treating the deposit as a single population sample rather than a collection of individuals with separate biographies. Yet, the sagas and the chronicles remind us that these were individuals with names, stories, and loved ones who waited for news that never came. We can imagine, for instance, a Danish mother named Thora, who lived in a farmstead near Roskilde, watching her son Esker board the longship in the spring, pressing a silver Thor's hammer amulet into his hand and making him swear to return before the autumn frosts. Esker, a young man of 22, with a healed broken nose from a childhood fight and a missing front tooth, was part of the Danish cluster. He had joined the lee of a chieftain named Ulf, drawn by the promise of a full share of Danegeld that would allow him to marry his sweetheart, Ragnhild. Instead, Esker ended up in a chalk pit in Dorset, his body thrown in with 53 strangers, his name forgotten. A Swedish warrior named Bjorn, from a farm near Gamla Uppsala, had been a regular at the great pagan sacrifices, a devotee of Thor and Frey, but he had also been baptized as a token of political convenience when his chieftain accepted Christianity. Bjorn carried a sword with a hilt inlaid with garnets, taken from a slain English thane in a previous raid. He lost that sword the day he was captured, and it was likely taken by the Dorset aldermen as a trophy. And from the far north, a man named Eirik, a Sami-Norse mixed blood from the island of Senja, a skilled whale hunter and archer, had been recruited for his ability to spot ships from afar. Eirik's strontium screamed of the Arctic, and his diet of seal and reindeer had given him nitrogen isotope values that set him apart. He died far from the frozen fjords, under a mild English autumn sky, bewildered by the greenness of the land and the cruelty of its defenders. The anonymity of the 54 is, in a sense, the central tragedy of their story. They were not kings or ealdormen whose names are written in the chronicle. They were the rank and file of the Viking Age, the foot soldiers whose labor and blood built the kingdoms and enriched the chieftains, but who are almost entirely absent from the written record. The mass grave at Weymouth is one of the few places where these invisible men become visible, their bones speaking in a chemical language that the sagas and chronicles never bothered to record. The isotopic analysis has given them back a kind of collective identity. They are the sons of Denmark, Sweden, and Norway, the mercenaries of the north, the storm crows of the Viking fleet. Their grave is a monument not to the glory of kings, but to the grim reality of the raiding economy, a pyramid scheme of violence in which the majority of participants paid with their lives so that a few could build timber halls and endow churches with English silver. The 54 heads piled in that pit are a more honest memorial to the Viking Age than any statue of a helmeted conqueror, because they show the true face of Viking success. A face drained of blood, eyes staring skyward, lying in the chalk of a foreign land, waiting 1,000 years for someone to finally tell their story. To place the Weymouth mass grave in its proper context, it is essential to compare it with the other known mass graves of executed Vikings in England, because together they form a pattern that reveals the shifting strategies of both the raiders and the defenders during the Second Viking Age. The most closely comparable site is the St. John's College charnel pit in Oxford, discovered in 2008 during the construction of a new quadrangle at the Oxford College. That pit contained the remains of between 34 and 38 individuals, predominantly young adult males, who had been subjected to extreme violence, Many had been stabbed multiple times, some had been disemboweled, and several had been burned. Radiocarbon dating placed the Oxford pit in the early 11th century, around AD 1000-1015. An isotopic analysis revealed that the victims were of Scandinavian origin, with a similar mix of Danish and Swedish signatures. The Oxford pit is widely associated with the St. Brice's Day massacre of 1002, an interpretation supported by the chronicle account of Danes being burnt in St. Fridswide's church. The violence at Oxford was more chaotic and frenzied than at Weymouth. The victims had been attacked from behind, stabbed in the back and the pelvis, and their bodies were dumped in a disused well or pit without any of the careful decapitation ritual seen on Ridgeway Hill. This suggests that the Oxford massacre was a civilian pogrom carried out by a mob, whereas the Weymouth execution was a military execution carried out by an organized force under disciplined command. The two events, though contemporaneous, represent the twin faces of Æthelred's anti-Danish policy, the chaotic pogrom in the towns and the calculated judicial killing on the battlefield. The Walkington Wold Execution Cemetery in the East Riding of Yorkshire, dating from the 10th to 11th centuries, offers another point of comparison. Walkington Wold was not a single mass grave but a cemetery of over 200 individuals, many of whom had been decapitated, and many of the skulls were missing or placed separately. The burial style, decapitation and separate skull burial, is very similar to Weymouth, and it has been interpreted as an Anglo Saxon judicial execution site for criminals and outlaws. Some of the Walkington Wold individuals, however, have isotopic signatures suggesting they were Vikings, indicating that captured raiders were sometimes executed at established execution grounds rather than at the site of capture. The difference at Weymouth is the single event, mass nature of the deposit, suggesting that the Dorset fjord improvised an execution ground on the spot rather than transporting the prisoners to a permanent execution site. The location on a prominent ridge, visible from the sea, is unique and reinforces the idea of a theatrical warning aimed at the ships. The other mass execution that is often cited in this context is the 11th century burial of 264 men at the Viking fortress of Trelleborg in Denmark. But that case is different. It was likely the interment of warriors who died from disease or a failed uprising, not judicial execution by a foreign enemy. The Weymouth grave stands alone as the largest single-event mass execution of a captured Viking raiding party yet discovered in England. The comparison also extends to the osteological trauma. At Oxford, the victims had a wide variety of weapon injuries, indicating a chaotic melee. At Ridgeway Hill, the trauma is uniform, decapitation from the front, with no defensive wounds. This uniformity suggests a single, methodical executioner, or a small team working in an identical manner. The trauma pattern is so regular that it resembles a state-sponsored execution, like those later conducted in the Tower of London, where the executioner's skill in delivering a single, clean stroke was a mark of professionalism. The Ridgeway Hill executioner may have been a Headless, a designated headsman who had performed the duty many times before. Such a figure would have been a valued member of the alderman's retinue, perhaps a freedman, or a thane who had a hereditary role. The contrast with Oxford's mob violence is stark. Weymouth was an execution, Oxford was a lynching. Yet both were born of the same royal policy, the same desperation to stop the Viking tide by any means necessary. The Dorset thanes who wielded the sword on Ridgeway Hill may have believed they were carrying out the king's justice and protecting their homes, just as the citizens of Oxford believed they were rooting out traitors in their midst. The tragedy is that both policies failed utterly. The St. Brice's Day massacre and the execution of captured raiders only provoked more ferocious Viking attacks, culminating in the conquest of England by Sweyn Forkbeard in 1013 and the eventual establishment of Knut the Great's North Sea Empire. The fate of Dorset in the years after the Ridgeway Hill execution illustrates this failure. The Anglo Saxon Chronicle records that in 1015, a vast Danish army led by Knut, the son of Sweyn, landed in Wessex and ravaged Dorset, Somerset, and Wiltshire. The Chronicle entry for 1015 reads, Knut came with his army into the mouth of the Frome, and harried in Dorset, and in Wiltshire, and in Somerset. The mouth of the Frome is at Wareham, not far from Weymouth. The Dorset fjord, which had so decisively annihilated the raiding party a decade or so earlier, was unable to stop Knut's professional army, which had learned the lessons of previous raids and now came in overwhelming force. By 1016, Knut had conquered all of England, and Æthelred was dead. The Ridgeway Hill grave, if it was known to the locals, might have been quietly visited by the families of the thanes who had carried out the execution, who would have had every reason to fear the revenge of the new Danish king. If Knut ever learned of the pit on the ridge, and he probably did, as his forces ranged across Dorset, he might have ordered it desecrated, or conversely, he might have let it be as a memorial to his fallen countrymen. The pit was not emptied or disturbed in antiquity, which suggests that it was either forgotten in the chaos of the conquest or left untouched out of respect for the dead. Whatever the case, the execution of the 54 Vikings did nothing to alter the arc of history. Within 2 decades, the Danish kings sat on the English throne, and the thanes of Dorset were paying their taxes to a Scandinavian overlord. The excavation of the Ridgeway Hill pit in 2009 was itself a drama of modern archaeology, pitting the tight schedules of a £87 million road construction project against the meticulous needs of a criminal-style forensic investigation. The Weymouth Relief Road, a 7-kilometer stretch of dual carriageway designed to bypass the congested villages of Upway and Broadway and connect the A354 to the A353, was a major infrastructure project for Dorset, heavily promoted in the run-up to the 2012 Olympic sailing events hosted in Weymouth Bay. The construction contract had been awarded to a joint venture of Skanska and Balfour Beatty, and the archaeological mitigation was the responsibility of Oxford Archaeology, a leading commercial unit in the UK. The discovery of human bone, initially a single femur uncovered by a bulldozer on the slope of Ridgeway Hill, triggered an immediate stop work order on that section of the site. Within 24 hours, the Oxford Archaeology team, led by senior project manager David Score, had established that the bones were articulated and that more were visible in the section of the newly cut slope. The site was cordoned off, a scene tent was erected to protect the remains from the weather, and the police were notified as per standard procedure. However, once the antiquity of the remains was confirmed by the presence of late Saxon pottery in the grave fill, the police released the scene to the archaeologists, and the full excavation began under a schedule pressure that was intense. The road builders needed the archaeologists to finish within a tightly defined window so that the earthworks could proceed, but the mass grave was clearly of major national significance. The excavation method was a hybrid of archaeological stratigraphy and forensic anthropology. The pit was initially exposed in plan, and the top of the bone deposit was carefully cleaned with wooden tools and soft brushes to reveal the jumbled mass of skeletons. A total station theodolite was used to plot the three-dimensional coordinates of every bone that was visible in the top layer. Photogrammetric recording, in which hundreds of overlapping digital photographs are stitched into a precise 3D model, was employed to create a permanent visual record of the deposit before any bones were lifted. The team then began the painstaking process of removing the bones one by one, working from the top down. Each bone was allocated a unique, small finds, number, bagged separately, and its position recorded on a digital plan. The skulls, which were at the south end of the pit, were particularly carefully excavated because they held the key to the isotopic and trauma analysis. The excavators noted that the skulls were stacked in a chaotic pile but that some appeared to have been placed face down, others face up, with no obvious pattern. The mandibles, lower jaws, were often detached from the skulls and found mixed in with the bodies, a natural consequence of decay and the slumping of the fill, but some jaws were found still articulated with the skull, indicating that the soft tissue, tendons and ligaments, was still holding them when the heads were buried. This rapid burial, within a day or so of death, was a crucial piece of taphonomic information. The soil from the pit fill was 100% sieved through a 5mm mesh to recover any small artifacts, teeth, or bone fragments that might have been missed. This was a labor-intensive process, with the Dorset chalky marl sticking to everything and requiring the sieves to be washed repeatedly. The sieving produced only a handful of artifacts, apart from the single iron buckle, some tiny fragments of unidentifiable iron, a few sherds of the Thetford-type pottery, and a single, enigmatic object, a small, crudely carved antler comb fragment, an object that was utterly Scandinavian in style and almost certainly belonged to one of the executed men. The comb fragment, though small, was a deeply personal item, used for combing lice and nits from hair and beards, a common object in the Viking toiletry kit. Its presence in the pit suggests that not all personal items were stripped from the bodies. Perhaps it was hidden in a pouch or tucked into a tunic and was missed by the executioners. The comb is now conserved and stored with the rest of the archive at the Dorset County Museum, a tiny, tangible link to the daily grooming habits of a man who, 1,000 years ago, stood on the deck of a longship and ran a comb through his hair before a day of plunder, unaware that he would never comb it again. The excavation also included an environmental sampling program aimed at understanding the landscape context. Soil samples were taken for pollen analysis, but the chalky, alkaline soil had destroyed most of the pollen grains, a common problem on the downs. Snail shells, however, were plentiful, and the molluscan analysis, conducted by a specialist, revealed a sequence from open grassland to disturbed soil and back to grassland, consistent with the digging of the pit, its rapid backfilling, and the subsequent establishment of chalk grassland vegetation. The snails indicated that the area was unshaded, grazed downland at the time of the execution, just as it is today. The archaeological team also excavated the area around the pit to see if there were any associated features, such as a gallows or a boundary marker, but found nothing. The pit was isolated. This isolation was significant. It was not part of a larger execution cemetery but a single, dedicated event. Once the excavation was completed, the bones were removed to the Oxford Archaeology Lab for analysis, and the construction of the relief road resumed. The road cutting now slices through Ridgeway Hill just a few meters from the spot where the pit was located, and thousands of cars daily pass within a stone's throw of the site, their drivers blissfully unaware of the grim history that lies beneath the asphalt. The reburial of the 54 Viking skeletons in 2014 was a quietly moving event that closed the circle of the modern intervention and addressed the ethical obligation to treat human remains with dignity, regardless of their centuries-old status as enemies. Following the completion of all scientific analyses, the Ministry of Justice granted a license for the remains to be reinterred, and the local community, led by the vicar of St. Nicholas's Church in Weymouth, Reverend Andrew Goff, offered a final resting place in the churchyard. St. Nicholas's is a 19th century church located in the seaside Buxton area of Weymouth, but its dedication to St. Nicholas, the patron saint of sailors, seemed particularly fitting for men who had lived and died by the sea. The reburial service, held on a blustery day in March 2014, was attended by the archaeologists, local history enthusiasts, and a small group of modern-day Vikings from a historical reenactment society, who came in full-period costume to pay their respects. The coffins, simple wooden boxes containing the commingled remains, because it was impossible to separate the individuals, were lowered into a single deep grave, and the vicar said prayers for the dead, acknowledging their humanity despite the centuries of conflict. A handsome stone memorial, carved from Portland stone, the very limestone that forms the nearby coast, was erected over the grave, bearing an inscription in both English and Old Norse runes. The English reads, "In memory of the 54 Viking warriors who were executed on Ridgeway Hill in the early 11th century and laid to rest here in 2014. The runic inscription, devised with the help of a specialist, spells out a simple message in Old Norse. Forum vernito goa, we go now to the gods. A respectful nod to the pagan beliefs that many of the men likely held, even though they lived in an era of Christian transition. The memorial and reburial were significant because they represented a contemporary act of reconciliation with the past, a recognition that the men in the pit were not just archaeological specimens but once living human beings who died a terrible death. The local response to the discovery was profound. Weymouth, a town more accustomed to punch and Judy shows and sandcastle competitions than to Viking mass graves, embraced the story as a unique addition to its heritage. The local museum, the Dorset County Museum in Dorchester, created a major exhibition titled Vikings, Life and Legend, which included a dramatic reconstruction of the execution, the original comb fragment, and a full explanation of the isotopic science. The exhibition drew record crowds and helped to fund further research. Schools in the area incorporated the Ridgeway Hill discovery into their curriculum, and children learned about strontium isotopes and Viking mercenaries, proving that even the youngest members of the community could connect with the deep history beneath their feet. The story also inspired a community play, The Ridgeway Pit, written by a local playwright and performed on the hill itself, with the actors processing up the slope at dusk, recreating the final march of the captured Vikings. The Weymouth mass grave, once a grim secret of the chalk, had become a point of civic pride and a catalyst for historical engagement. The reburial also provoked philosophical reflections within the archaeological community about the treatment of human remains. In the UK, the Guidance for the Treatment of Human Remains in Archaeology, issued by the British Association for Biological Anthropology and Osteoarchaeology, recommends that remains be reburied after a period of study, unless there is a strong justification for their retention in a museum. The Ridgeway Hill remains were not retained because the primary scientific value had been extracted through the isotopic sampling, 3D scanning, and comprehensive osteological reports, which are archived and available to researchers. Some scholars argue that the remains should have been kept for future analysis, given the rapid pace of technological advance in ancient DNA and proteomics. The next generation of techniques that might reveal the pathogens they carried, their precise kinship relations, or even their eye and hair color. However, the Ministry of Justice license specified reburial, and the ethical consensus favored returning the men to the ground, especially given the horrific nature of their death and the sense that they had already been on display long enough. The compromise was the creation of a full digital archive. The 3D scans of the skulls and bones are freely available online, allowing researchers anywhere to study the trauma and morphology without disturbing the actual remains. The Viking dead of Weymouth now rest in consecrated ground, under a Portland stone slab that stands as a permanent testament to their forgotten lives and to the power of modern science to pull their story back from the void. The reburial was not the end of the road for the research, however. The samples taken during the analysis, the drilled enamel powders, the collagen extracts, the tiny bone slivers, are stored in the archives of the British Geological Survey and Durham University, forming a tissue bank for future investigations. Already, pilot projects have used the stored collagen to conduct zooms, zooarchaeology by mass spectrometry, analysis to confirm the species of any faunal remains that might have been commingled, and there are plans to attempt the extraction of ancient proteins from the dental calculus to identify oral microbiota and diet with even greater precision. The story of the 54 is thus not a closed book but a living research project, one that continues to yield insights as the tools of science grow sharper. The reburial, rather than an end, was a respectful pause, a moment to honor the dead before the next generation of inquiry begins. For the families of the archaeologists and the people of Weymouth who attended the service, the burial was a reminder that the business of history is, at its core, about people. People who laughed, loved, and were afraid, who died violently, and who deserve, after 1,000 years, to be remembered with compassion. The long-term impact of the Weymouth mass grave on the field of Viking studies cannot be overstated. Before the 2009 discovery, the historical narrative of the Viking raids on England was largely driven by the written sources, the laconic entries of the Anglo Saxon Chronicle, the occasional charter, and the much later saga literature that often blended myth with history. Archaeological evidence for the actual encounters, the battles, the ambushes, the executions, was scant. Metal detectorists had found scattered weapons and hacked silver hoards, and graves like the one at Repton had provided evidence of the great heathen army's winter camp, but the gritty, intimate reality of the small-scale raiding that constituted the bulk of the Viking experience remained elusive. The Ridgeway Hill grave changed that by offering an almost cinematic snapshot of a single, catastrophic event, the capture and execution of a multinational crew. This snapshot has forced a reappraisal of the scale and organization of Viking warfare. The traditional image of the Viking longship crewed by a band of blood brothers from the same fjord has been supplanted by the isotopic evidence of a pan-Scandinavian mercenary market. The Ridgeway Hill crew, with its Danes, Swedes, and Arctic Norwegians showed that the Lee was a flexible, commercial institution that could aggregate warriors from across the Norse world, a model that has since been identified in other contexts, including the Varangian Guard in Constantinople and the armies of the Kievan Rus. The discovery also revitalized the study of Anglo Saxon military response. The Dorset FYRD's ability to trap, defeat, and execute a Viking raiding party within a matter of hours or days demonstrates a high level of organization and local knowledge that the national chroniclers, focused on the defeats and the Danegelds, tended to obscure. The Burhell system, the beacon chain, the 100 musters, these worked, at least at the local level, and the Weymouth grave is the proof. It has become a case study in military history courses, illustrating the concept of defense in depth, and the use of landscape as a weapon. The ridge, the valley, the marsh of the fleet, the topography of Dorset was as much a tool of victory as the swords of the Thanes. The site has also contributed to the study of early medieval judicial violence, providing a benchmark for what a state-sponsored mass execution looks like archaeologically, as distinct from a civilian massacre or a battlefield mass grave. Legal historians have used the Weymouth evidence to argue that Ætheled's orders, however ill-advised, were carried out with a procedural formality that suggests the existence of a standing legal framework for dealing with captured pirates, a framework that would later be codified in the 11th century law codes of Nut. The public engagement aspect of the Weymouth story has been a model for how archaeology can communicate science to a broad audience. The Oxford archaeology team, recognizing the immense public interest, launched a dedicated website, a series of popular articles in Current Archaeology and British Archaeology magazines, and a documentary that aired on the BBC's Digging for Britain program, presented by Dr. Alice Roberts. The episode, which featured interviews with the lead scientists and dramatic reenactments of the execution, drew millions of viewers and introduced a global audience to the concepts of strontium and oxygen isotope analysis. The use of the term, the Ridgeway Hill Vikings, became a recognizable brand, and the site is now a regular stop on historical tours of the Jurassic Coast. The scientific papers themselves, published in high-impact journals, have accumulated hundreds of citations and have inspired similar isotopic projects on other mass graves, such as the mass grave of 54 individuals discovered in the town of Liebring in Austria, which was subsequently analyzed using the same multi-isotope protocol and revealed a similar pattern of multi-regional recruitment in a 10th century Magyar raiding party. The Weymouth methodology has become an exportable template, and its success has helped to secure funding for other large-scale mobility studies in medieval Europe. Finally, the 54 men of Weymouth have come to symbolize the dark underside of the Viking Age, a period often romanticized for its shipbuilding prowess, its exploration, and its art. The headless bodies in the chalk pit are a corrective to the Vikings as noble savages trope. They remind us that the Viking economy was, at its core, an economy of slavery and plunder, and that the men who participated in it were taking a mortal gamble. For those 54, the gamble failed catastrophically. Their deaths were not heroic, they were sordid, terrifying, and anonymous. Yet, in that anonymity, they have become emblematic of the thousands upon thousands of young men who sailed across the North Sea with dreams of silver and glory, only to find a shallow grave on a windswept hill. Their story, resurrected by the most advanced scientific techniques of the 21st century, is a sobering testament to the universality of human experience, the longing for wealth, the willingness to risk death, the brutality of those who defend their homes, and the ultimate fragility of life. The Ridgeway Hill mass grave is a portal through which we can glimpse, with startling clarity, a single autumn day over 1,000 years ago, when the longboats lay at anchor in the bay, the spears glittered in the sun, and 54 men knelt on the chalk and lost their heads, one by one, to the sword of the Wessex fjord. The story of the 54 headless skeletons in the Weymouth mass grave is far more than a tale of a single, savage encounter on a remote English hillside. It is a story that weaves together the most advanced forensic science of our time with the brutal politics of the dying Anglo Saxon kingdom, the desperate courage of the fjord, and the cold logistics of the pan-Scandinavian war machine. From the moment the first bone was spotted in the chalk during the construction of the relief road, to the final isotopic revelations that shattered the myth of the homogeneous Viking raiding party. This archaeological saga has transformed our understanding of the Viking Age. The 54 warriors, their heads piled in a heap, their bodies thrown carelessly into a pit, became the reluctant witnesses to a globalized world of mercenaries, silver, and state-sponsored terror that existed 1,000 years ago. Their bones contained the map of their childhoods, written in strontium and oxygen isotopes that pointed unerringly to the fjords of Denmark, the lakelands of Sweden, and the frozen coasts of Arctic Norway. They had come together in a brotherhood of profit, a league bound by oath and silver, only to meet a common, gruesome end at the hands of an Anglo Saxon community determined to defend its land at any cost. The excavation of that chalk pit and the years of scientific analysis that followed have given these anonymous men a form of immortality, transforming them from a mass of confused bones into a detailed historical document, a testament to the interconnectedness of the medieval North Sea world. The Weymouth grave also serves as a powerful lens through which we can examine the nature of violence, justice, and identity in the early Middle Ages. The execution was an act of judicial terror, a calculated spectacle designed to send a message of defiance across the sea. The Anglo Saxon executioners wielded the sword in the name of the king and God, believing they were purging evil from their shores. The Vikings, for their part, were neither innocent victims nor faceless barbarians, but professionals engaged in a high-risk, high-reward enterprise that had drawn them across 1,000 miles of sea. Their execution, far from being a random atrocity, was a ritual that both sides understood within the shared Germanic culture of the head, honor, and the afterlife. The careful decapitation, the separate stacking of skulls, the burial in a boundary place on a high ridge, all of these details speak a language of symbolic violence that echoed from the Roman Iron Age to the Norman conquest. And yet, beyond the grand historical forces, the grave holds the personal, the intimate, the healed fractures of old duels, the dental hypoplasia of childhood famines, the worn-down teeth of a lifetime of hard bread and dried fish, the fragment of an antler comb dropped by a man who would never again need it. It is this fusion of the macro-historical and the micro-personal that makes the Ridgeway Hill Vikings so compelling, and that has ensured their story will endure. Reflecting on the legacy of this discovery, we are reminded that history is never truly buried. It waits in the earth for the right moment to speak. The Weymouth Relief Road, a project meant to speed cars to the Olympic sailing events, became an accidental time machine, opening a window onto a day of terror in the reign of Æthelred the Unready. The scientists who interpreted the bones, the archaeologists, the osteologists, the geochemists, acted as translators, converting the chemical whispers of the enamel into a narrative that the whole world could understand. Their work stands as a triumph of interdisciplinary collaboration, a model for how archaeology can answer questions that the written records never even thought to ask. The 54 men, who died without a chronicler to note their passing, have now been chronicled more thoroughly than many a medieval king. We know where they grew up, what they ate, how they fought, and how they died. We know that they were young, strong, and scarred by hard lives. We know that they came from different worlds but died in the same pit. In giving them back their stories, science has done what the executioners tried to prevent. It has restored their individual humanity, even if we will never know their names. As we stand on Ridgeway Hill today, with the wind blowing off the channel and the modern road humming below, it takes a leap of imagination to see the scene as it was 1,000 years ago, the line of kneeling men, the sword rising and falling, the pile of heads growing, the silent crowd of furred men watching. But thanks to the work of the last decade, that leap is no longer into fantasy. It is grounded in data, in bone chemistry, in cut marks and snail shells. The Weymouth mass grave has become a fixed point in our understanding of the Viking Age, a touchstone that will be cited and re-examined for as long as people are fascinated by the clash of cultures that forged the modern world. And for the channel, for our community of history enthusiasts, this story is exactly the kind of deep, evidence-driven narrative that we are passionate about sharing. It combines the thrill of discovery with the rigor of science and the emotional weight of a true crime from the distant past. We hope that you have found this journey into the chalk pit as gripping and enlightening as we have. This is Stories of Our History, and we are dedicated to bringing you the most astonishing, meticulously researched, and visually evocative narratives from the past. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the Headless Vikings of Weymouth, please smash that like button, because your engagement directly supports the channel and helps us reach a wider audience with these incredible tales. Do not forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell so that you never miss a new episode. We have many more stories of our history lined up, from the lost legions of Rome to the battlefields of the medieval world. Share this video with your friends, your family, and your history teachers. Let us spread the knowledge and the wonder. Leave a comment below. What aspect of the Viking Age would you like us to explore next? Perhaps the Siege of Paris, the voyages to America, or the great heathen army that conquered half of England? We read every comment, and your input directly shapes our future content. Thank you for watching and for being part of this community. I hope you enjoyed this content, and I'll see you in the next video.